I have been a hobbyist caver since the spring of 2008, and in October of 2014, I drove out from Knoxville on a Saturday morning to a small commercial cave I had been visiting for years on the Tennessee side of the Blue Ridge. The drive up through the foothills that morning was the kind of drive that makes you remember why people stay in East Tennessee. The maples were turning. The light was clean and slanted in the way it gets in the Appalachians in mid-October, when the haze thins out and the ridges look closer than they actually are. I was 34 years old. I had been caving as a hobbyist for about 6 years, and the small cave I was driving to was one of my regular Saturday destinations, the kind of overlooked family-run commercial system that used to be common in the Southeast and that was getting rarer every year. The cave itself was a half-mile loop of paved walking passage with simple electric lighting and a few interpretive signs, the kind of cave where families stopped on their way to Gatlinburg and where the tour took about 45 minutes and the tickets cost $10. Behind the commercial loop, accessible through a small gated side passage, was a network of wild cave that ran for about 1.5 miles through the limestone. Cavers who could show experience and pay a small additional fee were allowed to take a key from the office and explore the wild section on their own. The owners were an older couple in their 70s who had inherited the operation from the husband's father. The tour guide that morning was a quiet, white-haired man named Walter, who I had met on previous trips and who had given me my first Wild Passage tour 6 years before. I paid my fees. I signed the waiver. The older woman at the desk, Eunice, wrote down on her register that I expected to be in the wild section for about 3 hours. I joined the 11 o'clock commercial tour, which Walter led at his usual soft, polite pace. And at the end of the loop, he unlocked the gated entrance to the Wild Passage, told me to be careful, and turned the tour group back toward the entrance. I stepped through, locked the gate behind me from the inside, switched off the commercial lighting at a small wall switch beside the gate, and clicked on my headlamp. The tour passage went dark behind me. The Wild Passage was, as I remembered it, a walking corridor with a dry limestone floor, the ceiling at variable heights ranging from 8 feet to about 5 feet, the air at the steady 55 degrees that the cave maintained year-round. I had a particular fondness for a small loop that branched off the main Wild Passage about a 1/4 mile in. The loop ran for maybe 400 feet through a section of beautiful flowstone formations and rejoined the main passage about 100 feet further on. It was a gentle horizontal walk, mostly a comfortable crouch, with one small low spot near the back that required a brief belly crawl. I had walked it 5 or 6 times. It was the kind of small, overlooked feature that I had grown to enjoy returning to. I reached the entrance to the loop at about 11:30. I crouched through the low arched opening on the right side of the main passage, walked the 80-foot connector, and stopped at the curtain of flowstone, which was the most beautiful feature of the whole loop. I stood there for a few minutes, with my headlamp pointed at it, the way I always did. Then I continued past the calcite columns to the low spot, got down on my hands and knees, and started the belly crawl. I was about 15 feet into the crawl when my headlamp died. I want to describe this carefully because I have gone over it many times in the 11 years since. The lamp I was wearing was a good piece of equipment, an LED caving lamp that I had bought new the year before. I had checked the batteries that morning. The lamp had been working perfectly all morning, with a bright, steady, cool white beam. It did not flicker. It did not dim. It died in one moment, at full brightness, and went black. I was in the next half second in absolute darkness. I did not panic. Caving headlamps fail occasionally. I had a backup light, a small handheld LED, in the chest pocket of my caving suit. The crawl space around me was tight enough that I could not easily reach the chest pocket without lying flat first. I stopped. I lay flat on my belly. I worked my right hand up to the chest pocket. I unzipped the pocket. I pulled out the backup light. In the brief seconds while I was retrieving it, the cave was completely silent. I could hear nothing. My breathing was the only sound in the passage. And in that silence, I heard a soft click. It was a small mechanical sound. The kind of sound a key makes turning in a lock, or a small lever clicking into a different position, or a piece of metal settling into a notch. It came from ahead of me in the passage, somewhere past the end of the belly crawl, in the direction I had been heading. In the next moment, a small, steady, warm yellow light appeared in the passage ahead of me. It was not a flashlight. Flashlights produce a bluish-white cone with a sharp edge. This was different. It was a soft, ambient, warm yellow, the color of a candle flame or of a kerosene wick, with no sharp edge but rather a gentle gradient of brightness that fell off into the surrounding darkness. It was small. It cast a glow that illuminated maybe a 6-foot circle of the passage walls and ceiling around it. The source, from my position lying flat in the belly crawl, was about 30 feet ahead of me, past the end of the crawl. In the section of passage where the loop continued before rejoining the main wild passage, I held still for probably 10 seconds. The light did not move. It did not flicker. It did not change in any way. It just sat there, steady, casting its gentle glow. I clicked on my backup light. The cool white LED beam shot down the passage past my own body. It illuminated the rest of the belly crawl ahead of me. It went past the end of the crawl. It picked up the floor of the passage, where the warm yellow light was sitting. Resting on a flat limestone slab in the floor of the passage, about 30 feet from where I lay, was a brass kerosene lantern. It was a small, old hand lantern, of the kind that working men carried into mines and barns in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Brass base with a small fuel reservoir, a brass handle arching up over the top, a clear glass globe enclosing the wick. The brass had the patina of a lantern that had been used and cared for over many decades. The glass was clean. I could see, through the glass, a small, steady yellow flame burning on the wick. The lantern was sitting upright on the slab, not tipped, not balanced precariously, squarely on its flat base, as if somebody had set it down carefully a moment before. I lay there with my backup light pointed at the lantern. I waited. I did not see anybody in my beam. The passage past the lantern continued for perhaps another 50 feet before curving out of sight. I could see no boots. I could see no shadow of a person. I could see no movement. I tried to think. I considered whether the lantern might have been left in the passage by Walter or by the owners as some kind of historical display feature for cavers. I rejected this. I had walked the loop 5 or 6 times. There had never been a lantern. I considered whether another caver might have entered the wild passage behind me and walked past me through the narrow loop while I was admiring the curtain of flowstone, set up the lantern as a joke, and continued on. I rejected this too. The wild passage was accessed through a single locked gate. I had locked it behind me. The only key was the one in my pocket and the spare in the office. I made a decision, in the next moment, to crawl forward. I do not know why I made it. The careful, sober part of my mind was telling me to back out. A stronger part of me, the part that had been a caver for 6 years and that had spent enough hours in caves to feel a curiosity that overrode the immediate pull of caution, decided to keep going. I crawled the remaining 15 feet. I came out into the small, wider section of passage past the low spot. I got to my feet. I walked the 15 feet to the limestone slab. I stopped about 2 feet from the lantern. I looked at it. The flame was steady. The wick was burning at a height of about half an inch, the way a properly trimmed kerosene wick burns when it has been adjusted carefully. The fuel level in the reservoir was visible through a small slit in the brass. The reservoir was half full. The glass globe was clean and free of soot. I knelt down. I reached out. I picked up the lantern by its brass handle. The handle was cold. I want to be precise about this. The lantern had been burning long enough to produce a small, steady flame. The brass body, particularly the upper portion near the burner, should have been warm. The handle, which arched up over the top of the burner, should have been the warmest part of the lantern. It should have been hot enough that I would have felt the heat through my caving glove. It was cold, not cool, cold. The temperature of the cave, 55 degrees. I could feel, through my glove, that the brass had not been heated by the flame at all. I held the lantern up. I looked at it from different angles. The flame burned steady and warm in front of my face. I could feel no heat from the flame. The air above the burner, where the heat from a kerosene flame would normally rise, was the same 55 degrees as the rest of the passage. I set the lantern down very carefully on the limestone slab. I set it back in the same position I had picked it up from, upright, on its flat base, squarely on the slab. I turned around. I want to be clear about this. I did not run. I did not crash back through the belly crawl in a panic. I crouched calmly, the way a caver crouches to enter a low spot, and I worked my way back through the 30 feet of low passage at the same steady pace I had used coming through the first time. I did not look back. I did not check whether the lantern was still burning behind me. I did not want to know. I walked the quarter-mile back to the gate. I unlocked it. I stepped through. I locked it behind me. I turned the commercial lighting on. I walked through the lit commercial loop to the entrance. Walter was at the entrance, talking to a small group of tourists who had arrived for the next tour. He saw me come up the passage. He stepped away from the group. He walked over to me. He looked at my face and said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" I said, "Walter, I need to ask you something." I described what I had seen, in the order it had happened. The headlamp dying, the click, the warm yellow light, the lantern on the slab, the cold brass handle. His face was the practiced, calm face of a man who had heard a great many small, odd reports from cavers over the decades. His face stayed calm while I told the first part of the story. When I described the lantern, his face went still in a particular way. Not surprised, not disbelieving, simply still, the way an older person's face goes still when they hear a thing they have heard before and have hoped not to hear again. When I had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you describe the lantern?" I described it, the brass body, the arched handle, the clear glass globe. He looked at me. He looked at the floor. He looked at me again. He said, in a careful voice, "I am going to ask you a favor. I am going to ask you to please not come back to this cave. I will refund your wild passage fee today. I will not put any of this on a record. I would prefer that you not tell other cavers about this. Would you be willing to agree to that?" I said, "Walter, what was the lantern?" He said, "I cannot tell you that." I said, "Have other cavers seen it?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, sir, from time to time." I said, "Are they still allowed to come back?" He said, "I have made the same request of every one of them. Every one of them has agreed." He refunded my wild passage fee that morning. He shook my hand. He told me to be careful on the drive home. I have not been back to that cave in the 11 years since. The older couple has retired. Walter passed in the winter of 2019. I went to neither his funeral nor the older couple's retirement gathering. I have a small sketchbook from a previous trip with a careful pencil drawing of the curtain of flowstone in that loop. I have not opened the sketchbook in many years. I keep it in a closet at my home. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the cold brass handle of the lantern has not, in the 11 years since I held it, taken on any warmth that would suggest it has been held by living hands. I do not know whether to believe my own hope. The lantern is sitting on its slab. It has been waiting there a long time. Walter knew, he would not say. And the small, steady, warm yellow light I saw burning in the dark 30 feet ahead of me on a Saturday morning in October is something I am content to leave on its slab, where it has been waiting and where I hope it stays. I had been caving for about 11 years by the spring of 2018, and I was 42 years old that April when I drove out from my house in southwestern Virginia to meet a small 4-person survey team at the trailhead of a long-known cave system in the Blue Ridge country of a rural county about 90 minutes from where I lived. The cave had been mapped in detail by a careful team in the 1980s, and our project that spring was a maintenance survey, focused on updating the older map data in a few side passages that the previous teams had documented to a less complete standard than the rest of the system. The total surveyed length of the cave was about 4 miles. The side passage we had been assigned to update was a small lead about half a mile in from the entrance, branching off the main trunk passage at a section we called the Boulder Choke, where a series of long-ago breakdown events had partially blocked the passage with a tight squeeze through fallen limestone before it opened into a small chamber on the other side and continued for perhaps another 500 feet of unmapped corridor. There were 4 of us on the team. Our trip leader was a careful, experienced woman in her late 50s named Phyllis, who had been caving in southwestern Virginia for 30 years and who had been part of the original 1980s survey team that had mapped the cave. Our lead surveyor was a man in his mid-40s named Curtis, a structural engineer by profession who handled most of our organization's technical mapping work. A younger woman in her early 30s named Annie was on her first trip with our team but had a strong intermediate background in caving from a club in Tennessee. And me, we had drawn up a plan for the trip about 3 weeks in advance. We expected to be underground for about 8 hours, including the survey work and the hike in and out. We met at the trailhead at 7 in the morning on a Saturday in mid-April. The morning was clear and cool, with the early spring buds just starting to appear on the hardwoods around the cave entrance. We hiked the quarter-mile into the entrance, suited up, ran our pre-trip checks, and went underground at about 8. The hike to the boulder choke took us about an hour through walking passage. We reached the entrance to the choke at about 9. Phyllis had us pause for a few minutes at the choke to drink some water and to talk through the order in which we would push the squeeze. The boulder choke was a tight squeeze through a section of fallen limestone where a large block had wedged across the passage at some point in the deep past, leaving only a low gap at the bottom that a caver could push through with effort. The squeeze was about 12 feet long, low enough that you had to crawl on your belly, and tight enough that you had to push your pack ahead of you and angle your shoulders carefully to get through. I had been through it twice before on previous trips. I knew the route. The plan was for me to go through first, since I was the most familiar with the squeeze, and to call back to the team once I was clear and had verified that the chamber on the other side was as we remembered it. I went through. It took me about 3 minutes. I came out on the other side into the small chamber that I remembered from my previous trips. I stood up slowly, stretching my back. I clicked my headlamp from its low setting up to its bright setting. I shone the beam around the chamber. I want to describe the room carefully because I have gone over it many thousands of times in the 7 years since. It was roughly oval-shaped, about 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a flat ceiling about 8 feet high at the highest point and lower toward the edges. The floor was the typical limestone of the region, with a thin layer of fine cave silt across most of it. The walls were familiar gray-brown limestone with a few small flowstone deposits along the lower portions and a single small calcite formation on the back wall. The chamber was, as I remembered it, it was a perfectly ordinary small cave room. In the chamber was a boy. He was about 15 feet in front of me, sitting on a small flat slab of limestone that protruded from the floor near the back of the chamber. He was a small boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, slender, short brown hair, the kind of haircut a country mother gives a country boy who needs his hair kept out of his eyes. His skin was pale but not unhealthy looking. His eyes were dark. He was wearing plain clothes. Blue jeans, a little worn at the knees, but otherwise in good shape. A gray cotton t-shirt, plain, with no logo or print. His sneakers were old white canvas sneakers, scuffed at the toes, the kind of cheap sneakers that working families bought for their children at the small department stores that used to be in every Virginia county seat. He had no jacket. His arms were bare from his short sleeves. His hands were resting on his knees. He had no caving gear, no helmet, no headlamp, no pack, no light source of any kind. He had no water bottle. He had no food. He had nothing on his person that suggested he was equipped for being underground. The only light in the chamber was my headlamp. He was sitting in the cone of my beam, perfectly illuminated. His pupils, in my bright caving light, did not contract. He was looking at me directly. His eyes did not narrow against the brightness. His expression did not change. He was watching me with the same calm, steady attention with which a child watches a slow event in a quiet room. He did not move. His chest, when I looked at it carefully, did not appear to be rising and falling. He did not blink. I do not know how to describe the cold that came into me as I stood in the doorway of the squeeze and looked at him. I had been caving for 11 years. I had developed, over those 11 years, a practical caver's discipline of not panicking in confined spaces. The discipline served me here. I did not jump. I did not back into the squeeze. I held very still. I considered, in the first moment, whether I was looking at a lost child. There were stories every year in the rural counties of Virginia about a child who had wandered off from a family campsite or a hiking trail and had disappeared into the woods. Children sometimes ended up in caves. The cave entrance was not far from a small public campground. I rejected the explanation almost immediately. The boulder choke was a difficult squeeze for an experienced caver. It was not the kind of feature that a 9 or 10-year-old boy in canvas sneakers and a t-shirt would have pushed through in the dark, alone, by accident. The chamber I was now standing in was a closed space. Other than the squeeze I had come through, it had no exit. The walls and ceiling were solid limestone, and I had verified this on previous trips. There was no other way in. There was no way for a child to have ended up here from the surface without coming through that exact squeeze. I considered, also briefly, whether the boy was a hallucination. I rejected this too. I had eaten a full breakfast. I was hydrated. I had no history of hallucinations. The boy was too detailed, too specifically clothed, too consistent in his appearance. I said, in a careful voice, "Hello." The boy did not respond. He continued to watch me. His face did not change. I said, "Are you all right? Are you hurt?" He did not respond. I said, "Can you hear me?" He did not respond. I called back through the squeeze to my team. I turned my head partly. I did not turn my whole body. I kept my eyes on the boy as long as I could. I cupped my hand to the side of my mouth and I called, loud enough for my voice to carry through the squeeze. "Phyllis, Curtis, there is a child in here." I heard faintly through the squeeze Phyllis's voice ask, "Say again?" I had to turn my head a little further to call back through the squeeze clearly. My eyes left the boy for perhaps 2 seconds. I said, "There is a child in here. A boy. I am not sure how he got here." There was a moment of silence. Then I heard Curtis say, "We are coming through." I turned my head back to the chamber. To the boy on the rock. The boy was not there. The chamber was the same chamber. The flat slab of limestone was the same slab. The cave silt on the floor was the same silt. My headlamp was illuminating the same area. But the boy was gone, not moved aside, not crouched down, not partially obscured, simply gone. The slab was empty. The cave silt around the slab was undisturbed. There was no body. There was no shape. There was nothing. I did not call out again. I did not move. I shone my headlamp slowly around the entire chamber. I checked every wall. I checked the corners. I checked the small calcite formation on the back wall. I checked the area immediately behind the slab. I checked the floor. There were no footprints anywhere. The cave silt was as undisturbed as it had been when I first came through the squeeze. No marks, no drag patterns, no scuffs. Curtis came through the squeeze about a minute later. He stood up beside me. He looked at me. He said, "Where is the child?" I said, "I don't know." He was right there. On that slab, he was looking at me. Curtis went quiet for a moment. Then Annie came through. Then Phyllis. The 4 of us stood in the chamber. Phyllis was the senior member of the team. She listened while I described, in detail, what I had seen. She did not interrupt. She did not express skepticism. When I had finished, she nodded slowly. She said, "All right, let's search the chamber, carefully and methodically." We searched the chamber for 40 minutes. We did it the way an experienced caving team searches a small enclosed space. We started at one end and worked toward the other. We checked every wall, every crack, every overhang, every irregularity in the rock. We checked behind the calcite formation. We checked along the floor for any small opening that might have admitted a child. We checked the ceiling for any vertical fissure that might have led upward. We found nothing. The chamber was a closed space. There was no other exit. There was no place where a small body could have hidden. There were no footprints. The flat slab where the boy had been sitting had no impression on its dust, the kind of light dust that would have shown a body's mark if a body had recently sat there. There was no thread caught on any rough rock. There was no hair. There was no scuff of a sneaker's edge. There was no sign that any child or any other person had ever been in the chamber other than the 4 of us. Phyllis was quiet for a long time after we finished the search. Then she said, "We are not going to put this in the report." Curtis said, Phyllis said, "We are not going to put this in the report. We are going to finish the survey we came down here to do in the next 500 feet of passage past this chamber, and then we are going to walk out, and we are not going to talk about this on the surface. Are we agreed?" I said yes. Curtis said yes. Annie was new. She looked at Phyllis and asked, in a quiet voice, "Phyllis, has this happened before?" Phyllis did not answer immediately. She looked at the calcite formation on the back wall. She looked at the slab where I had seen the boy. She looked at Annie. She said, "I cannot tell you that, Annie." What I can tell you is that some chambers in this cave have been the subject of small, careful agreements among our organization's older members for a long time, and that those agreements have been honored, and that we are going to honor them now. Annie nodded. She did not ask any further questions. We did the survey work in the 500 feet of passage past the chamber. The work took us about 3 hours. We came back through the chamber on the way out. Nobody was on the slab. The chamber was as we had left it. We pushed through the squeeze and walked out. We came up out of the cave at about 4:30 in the afternoon. We hiked back to our cars. We drove home. The trip report Phyllis filed described the survey work in the 500 feet of passage past the boulder choke. The chamber was sketched on the master map with no notations other than its dimensions. No mention of any encounter. No anomaly noted. The report was filed with our organization in May of 2018. In the 7 years since, I have not been back to that cave. Phyllis retired from active caving in 2021. Curtis has continued to do occasional survey work with our organization, but I have never asked him whether he has been back to that particular cave. We have caved together on other projects, in other systems, and we have never discussed what happened in the chamber. Annie moved to a different organization in 2020, and I have lost track of her. I have thought many times about the boy. I have thought about whether he was a child who had died in that cave at some point in its long history, perhaps generations ago. Perhaps a child who had wandered in from a family farm in the 1930s or the 1940s and had not come back out. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the boy is at peace. I have hoped that the calm, steady look he gave me when I came through the squeeze was not a request for help that I was unable to provide. I have a small framed photograph of myself and Phyllis and Curtis and Annie, taken at the cave entrance the morning of the trip, that I have kept in a drawer in my home office for 7 years. I look at it sometimes. About a year ago, I noticed a small detail in the photograph that I never noticed before. In the background, just past the cave entrance, in the partial light at the edge of the shadow, there is a small figure standing among the trees. I cannot make out his face, but he is wearing a gray t-shirt, and he is barefoot, and his hair is short and brown, and he is looking from his place at the tree line directly at the camera. I have not shown the photograph to anyone. I have put it back in the drawer. I have not opened the drawer since. I had been a sport diver for about 12 years and a cave diver for about 6 by the summer of 2019, and I was 39 years old that July when I drove down to a small commercial cave system on a piece of private land in a rural county of northern Alabama in the Blue Ridge foothills to do a routine solo photo run in a sump my club had been working for almost 40 years. My day job was as a paramedic with a county emergency services agency in northern Alabama. The work gave me good shifts and reasonable time off and left me physically conditioned for the demands of cave diving. And I had joined a regional cave diving club a year or so after I had certified, and over the following years I had become a regular member of that club, working through the known sump systems of northern Alabama, southern Tennessee, and the karst country of North Georgia. The sump I am writing about was a long-known underwater passage in a small commercial cave system on private land in a rural county of northern Alabama. The cave had been a tourist attraction since the 1930s, with a half-mile loop of guided walking passage that families had been visiting for almost a century. Behind the commercial loop, accessible through a small gated side passage, was a network of wild cave that included the sump our club worked. The sump itself had been first dived in 1981. It was about 300 yards in length underwater, with a known maximum depth of about 90 feet at the deepest section. It was a popular sump for our club because it was relatively forgiving by cave diving standards, with good visibility, a clean clay bottom, and a permanent guideline that the club maintained on a regular schedule. It had been dived hundreds of times over the years. The dive I am writing about was a routine solo photo run that I had cleared with the club's safety officer 2 weeks in advance. I had been working on a photo project for one of our club's quarterly newsletters, documenting the various sumps in our region with a series of careful underwater photographs. The Alabama sump had been on my list for about a year. I had finally found a free Saturday in mid-July and had driven down the night before, staying at a small motel in the nearest town. I was the only diver scheduled to be at the sump that morning. The cave's owners had granted access through their standard arrangement with our club, with a signed waiver and a posted dive plan that I had filed with the club's safety officer. I drove out to the cave at 6 in the morning. The owner's office was not yet open. I unlocked the small access gate at the back of the property, using the combination the club kept on file, and walked the half-mile of overgrown trail to the wild cave entrance, carrying my dive gear and 2 waterproof packs. The morning was hot and humid in the way northern Alabama summer mornings are hot and humid, and I was sweating by the time I reached the cave entrance. I dropped my packs, took a few minutes to cool down in the 70-degree air at the cave mouth, and then carried my gear into the entry pool of the sump. The entry pool was a small pool of standing water at the back of a dry chamber about 50 feet inside the cave. The pool was about 15 feet across and looked, at the surface, like an ordinary still pool. Below the surface, the pool dropped about 30 feet to a horizontal limestone shelf where the permanent guideline began, and the underwater passage ran for 300 yards through the limestone before resurfacing in a separate dry chamber on the other side. I suited up. I ran through my pre-dive checks twice. Cave diving solo is a discipline that does not forgive carelessness. I checked my dry suit seals. I checked my double tanks. I checked my primary and backup regulators. I checked my primary and backup dive lights. I checked my dive computer. I checked my reel. I checked my underwater camera and its housing. I checked my slate. I made a written note of my entry time on my slate, and on the small surface log I kept at the pool's edge. I planned for a 45-minute dive, with 20 minutes of bottom time at the deepest section of the sump, and the rest of the time devoted to ascent and to working back along the line. I splashed in at about 7:30. The water at the entry pool was cold, the typical mid-50s temperature of cave water in the region. I descended slowly, equalizing carefully, following the guideline down the 30 feet of vertical pool to the limestone shelf at the bottom. The water was unusually clear that morning. I had probably 40 feet of visibility, which was about as good as visibility ever got in the sump. I followed the guideline along the passage. The walls were the typical limestone of the region, with the clean, water-polished surface that long submersion produces. I passed several familiar features that I had seen in photographs taken by other club members. A small overhang at about 40 feet of depth, a narrow constriction at about 50 feet. The shape of the passage was as the maps described it. I was on a known route in a known sump. I reached the deepest section of the sump at about 10 minutes into the dive. The depth gauge on my dive computer read 91 feet. I clipped my reel onto a small bolt at one of the survey stations, which was the standard procedure for orienting myself for the photo work. I pulled out my underwater camera and began to take a series of careful, documented photographs of the deep section. The camera's flash strobe lit the chamber in small, bright pulses every few seconds. It was during the photography work, about 3 minutes into my time at the bottom, that I first heard the singing. The sound came in the small intervals between the camera flashes, in the soft, dim, ambient light of my primary dive light alone. It was faint at first. I almost did not register it. I might have written it off as a small acoustic artifact of my regulator, the way a working regulator can produce small ambient sounds in the breathing cycle that an experienced diver learns to filter out. But the sound persisted. It did not match my breathing cycle. It continued through my inhalations and my exhalations. It continued when I held my breath briefly to take a steady photograph. It was not a regulator sound. It was a woman singing. I want to describe the singing precisely. It was not loud. It was not close. It had the particular quality of a voice heard through water from some distance away, slightly muffled and slightly distorted in the way water muffles and distorts sounds, but unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, a clear alto register. The voice was humming a melody, not singing words. The melody was slow and measured, in a key I did not recognize as any standard Western musical scale. It was not a hymn that I knew. It was not a song from the radio or from any popular music tradition I could identify. It was a slow, careful sequence of notes that the voice sang without apparent effort, in long, sustained breaths, with a small, natural vibrato of the kind that a real human voice produces. I stopped photographing. I held my position with my fins. I listened. The singing continued. The voice did not change in volume. It did not change in direction that I could determine. It seemed to come from all around me, as sound does in water when it is being conducted through the column from some distant source. The voice was steady, calm, unhurried. It was not the voice of a person in distress. It was not a cry for help. It was the voice of a woman humming to herself, in the way a woman might hum to herself while she is doing some quiet domestic task, the way my own grandmother used to hum in her kitchen in Alabama when I was a small boy. I was a paramedic. I had been trained to remain calm under conditions that overwhelmed most ordinary people. I was a cave diver. I had been trained additionally to remain calm under conditions that overwhelmed most ordinary divers. The combination of those two trainings had shaped a particular professional reflex of running through possible explanations for unexpected stimuli in a measured, rational sequence, before allowing fear to dictate any reaction. I considered whether the sound might be coming from another diver in the sump. I rejected this. I was the only diver scheduled at the sump that morning. The water above me was undisturbed. I had not seen any other guideline on my way down. I considered whether the sound might be a recording, a speaker that had been placed in the sump as some prank or as part of a research project I did not know about. I rejected this. The cave was on private land with limited access. The owners did not permit any equipment to be left in the sump between dives. The club removed all gear after every trip. There was no power source for any speaker. I considered whether the sound might be a hallucination caused by nitrogen narcosis. The standard threshold for narcosis on a normal air mix is about 100 feet of depth. I was at 91. I checked my dive computer carefully. The computer was reading normal nitrogen exposure for my depth and time. I checked my breathing rate against my own internal sense. It was steady and slow. I checked my hand for the small motor tremor that sometimes accompanies early narcosis. There was no tremor. I considered whether the sound might be coming from the surface, from a person standing somewhere on the cave property above the sump, singing into a vent or a fissure that connected acoustically to the underwater passage. I rejected this too. The cave was on a remote piece of property. The owner's office was not yet open. The dry cave passage above the sump was empty. I had walked through it myself an hour before. There was nobody on the property except me. I considered finally that the sound was simply happening, that it was real, that it was a woman's voice singing to itself in some part of the sump that I could not see for some reason I did not understand, and that the explanation, whatever it was not within my ability to reconstruct from the information I had at the bottom of an Alabama cave sump. I made a small, careful decision in that moment. I decided that I was going to complete my photo work as planned, that I was going to ascend on my planned schedule, and that I was not going to react to the singing in any way that suggested I was aware of it. I do not know why I made that decision. It was not a calculated decision. It was something more instinctive than that. It was the same kind of instinct that had told me, on dive trips and on emergency calls over the years, that some situations were best handled by staying steady and finishing what you had come to do. I continued my photography. I took maybe 40 more photographs over the next 12 minutes. The singing continued throughout. The voice did not change in volume. It did not get closer. It did not get further away. It did not respond to my flash strobes. It did not respond to any of my movements. The melody continued, slow and steady, in the same unfamiliar key, with the same calm, careful breath control. I did not feel afraid in the way I might have expected to feel afraid. I felt, instead, a deep, cold awareness that something in this sump was making this sound, and that I was not the audience for the sound, and that I should complete my work and leave without acknowledging it. At 15 minutes of bottom time, I checked my dive computer. I was at my planned ascent point. I unclipped my reel from the survey station. I packed the camera into its harness clip. I started up the guideline. The singing stopped. The singing did not fade. It did not gradually decrease in volume. It did not move away. It stopped, cleanly. In one moment, between one breath and the next, the voice cut off, and the sump returned to the ordinary ambient sounds of a cave dive. The small hiss of my regulator, the small mechanical clicks of my dive computer, the soft whir of the small particles drifting in the water around me. The voice was simply gone. I made my ascent on my planned schedule. I stopped at my decompression depths. I worked back along the line. I came up out of the entry pool at the surface. I climbed out of the water onto the dry stone of the chamber. I sat on a flat rock and I did not move for probably 15 minutes. I did not put the singing in my dive report. The report I filed with the club's safety officer described a routine 45-minute solo photo dive at the Alabama sump with no anomalies. I submitted 38 of the photographs I had taken to the newsletter committee. They were used in the next quarterly issue. The newsletter went out to the club membership in October, and I went on with my life, and for about 4 months, I tried not to think about what I had heard in the deep water. About 4 months after the dive, at a club gathering at a barbecue restaurant in Huntsville, I had a quiet conversation with the club's senior dive supervisor, a man in his 60s named Bart, who had been part of the club since the 1980s. The conversation lulled. I asked him, in as casual a voice as I could manage, whether he had ever heard anything strange in the Alabama sump during one of his dives. Bart looked at me for a long moment. He set down his sweet tea. He looked at the table. He looked back at me. He said, in a quiet, careful voice, "Tell me what you heard." I told him. I told him about the singing. I described the sound, the duration, the way it had stopped at my ascent, the way my equipment had logged a normal dive. Bart listened without interrupting. When I had finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "2 other divers in our club have reported the same thing in the last 5 years. Both of them were experienced solo divers. Both of them heard a woman humming a slow melody at depth. Both of them said the singing started a few minutes after they reached the bottom and stopped at their ascent. Both of them said their equipment logged normal dives. Both of them, at my recommendation, did not put the singing in their reports. Neither of them has gone back to that sump." I asked him whether the sump had been removed from the dive list. He said it had been. He said the club would be ending its access agreement at the end of the calendar year. He asked me, as a personal favor, not to discuss this with other club members. I told him I would not. He picked up his sweet tea and took a long drink, and we talked about an upcoming Georgia trip, and we did not mention the Alabama sump again. The Alabama sump was indeed removed from our club's dive schedule, starting in January 2020. The cave's owners sold the property in 2022 to a regional land conservancy that has permanently closed public and recreational access to the cave system. The commercial tour operation has been shut down. The Wild Passage gate has been welded closed. As far as I know, no diver has been in the sump since I was. I have looked, casually, at old county newspaper archives. There was a young woman in 1947 who was reported missing from a small farm about 3 miles from the cave property. Her body was never found. The case was officially closed as an open missing person. I do not know whether she had any connection to the cave, and I have decided not to look any further. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the woman whose voice I heard in the sump is at peace, in some way I cannot understand, and that the singing is a small private thing she does for her own quiet reasons, and that she did not particularly want me to hear her on that morning in July, but did not particularly mind. I dive other sumps now, in other states, on other Saturdays, and I am grateful, every time I splash in, for the silence of the cold, clear water. I had been caving for about 7 years by the fall of 2016, and I was 33 years old that October when I drove out from my apartment in Charleston, West Virginia, on a Saturday morning to a small cave on a piece of private land in a rural county of the southern Blue Ridge country. My day job was as a software developer for a regional health insurance company, and the caving had become, over those 7 years, the thing that balanced out the long days at a desk, staring at monitors. I liked the small, physical, particular world of underground passages, the way a cave system asked you to be present in your own body in a way that almost nothing on the surface asked you to be. I was, by build and by inclination, a small passage specialist. I am 5'8", and at that time I weighed 140 pounds, and I had the kind of long-limbed, lean build that allowed me to fit through openings that bigger cavers could not. Within our club, I was the person who got asked to push tight leads. I had crawled through gaps that other people in the club had to pass on. I had a quiet pride in this. I had been through some of the tighter passages in the southern Appalachians, and I had come out of all of them with the small, steady satisfaction of having done a thing that not many people could do. The cave itself was a small system on a piece of private land in southern West Virginia, on a property that one of our older club members had a long arrangement with. The cave was modest by southern Appalachian standards, about a mile of mapped passage, mostly horizontal, with a few small side leads and one section of moderate vertical work near the back. It was not a famous cave. It did not appear in any of the regional caving guides. It was the kind of small, overlooked cave that local clubs work, and that the broader caving community largely ignores. The feature of the cave I want to describe was a belly crawl about a third of a mile in from the entrance, in a narrow section of passage, where the floor and ceiling pinched down to about 18 inches of clearance over a dry clay and silt floor. The crawl was approximately 30 feet long. To get through it, you had to lie flat on your stomach, push your pack ahead of you with your right arm extended, keep your head turned to the right side to clear the ceiling, and propel yourself forward with the toes of your boots and the small forward shifts of your hips. The crawl had a slight rightward bend in the middle that you had to angle around carefully. Coming out the other side, the passage widened back into a comfortable crouch walk that led to the deeper sections of the cave. I had been through the crawl 6 times before the trip I am writing about. The first time had been in the spring of 2013, on my first visit to that cave with 2 more experienced club members. The second through 5th times had been on subsequent group trips over the following 2 years, as our club had done occasional survey work and recreational visits to the system. The 6th time had been in the spring of 2016, 6 months before, on a small 2-person trip with one of my regular caving partners. The crawl was familiar to me. I knew its dimensions. I knew the small features of the floor that you came across as you moved through it. A small shallow depression at about 8 feet in, a slight rise at about 15 feet, the rightward bend at about 18 feet, a small, smooth section of floor at about 25 feet just before you came out the other side. I had memorized these features the way a thin caver memorizes the features of any tight passage they expect to traverse repeatedly. The memorization was a small safety habit. If anything went wrong in the crawl, the small particular features of the floor were the way I would orient myself in the dark. I went into the cave on that Saturday morning in mid-October of 2016 with a regular caving partner named Maddox. Maddox was a man in my club, in his late 30s, who had been caving for about 15 years. He was a bigger man than I was, 6'1" and probably 220 pounds, and he could not fit through the crawl. The plan for the day was for Maddox to wait at the near end of the crawl while I went through, did some survey work in a small side passage on the far side that we had identified as needing updates, and came back out. The work I had planned would take me probably 90 minutes on the far side. Maddox had brought a small camp chair and a paperback novel, and he was looking forward to 90 quiet minutes of reading by the light of his headlamp. We hiked into the cave through the comfortable walking passage of the first quarter mile, came down a short scramble, and reached the entrance to the belly crawl at about 10 in the morning. We took a few minutes at the entrance to drink some water, eat a snack, and run our pre-crawl checks. Maddox set up his chair. I checked my survey gear, my headlamp, my backup light, my handheld backup, my water bottle. I tied a small thin guideline to a bolt that the previous survey teams had set at the crawl's entrance, the way a cave surveyor sometimes sets a line in a tight passage as an additional safety measure for finding the way back in low visibility. I clipped the line's reel to my belt. I lay down on the floor. I started the crawl. The first 15 feet were ordinary. I worked my way through the crawl the way I had worked my way through it 6 times before, with the same hip shifts, the same toe propulsion, the same head-right orientation against the ceiling. I felt the small, shallow depression at about 8 feet. I felt the slight rise at about 15 feet. The crawl was as I remembered it. The clay floor was dry. The ceiling was the same uneven gray-brown limestone I had been pressing my back against on every previous trip. I was making good time. I expected to clear the crawl in about 3 minutes, my usual pace. At about 15 feet in, where the slight rise in the floor came up under my chest, I felt the ceiling press down against my back. I want to describe this carefully, because I have gone over this sensation many times in the 9 years since. The pressure was not a sudden bump. It was not the way you sometimes scrape against an unexpected protrusion in a tight passage. It was a slow, even downward force. The ceiling, the entire ceiling above me, the irregular limestone surface that had been hovering an inch or two above my back through the previous 15 feet of crawl, was now pressing down against my pack and my shoulder blades and the back of my helmet with a steady, firm pressure that did not match anything in my caving experience. The pressure was not sharp. It did not feel like a single block of breakdown shifting downward, the way breakdown sometimes shifts after long settling. It felt like the entire span of ceiling above the crawl, from one limestone wall to the other, was being lowered, slowly, by some external force operating from above the rock. The pressure was even across my whole back. It was distributed. It was steady. It was increasing. I stopped moving forward. I held my position. The pressure continued to increase for probably 2 more seconds, and then it stabilized, holding against me at a level that pinned me firmly to the clay floor without yet crushing me. I could not move forward. I could not turn over. I could feel the cold rock pressing against my back through my caving suit, in a long, even line from my shoulders to my hips. I held very still. I tried to think. I considered, in the first moment, that I was experiencing some kind of sudden settling event in the cave. Cave systems sometimes do shift, and the consequences of being in a tight crawl during a shift are exactly the kind of consequences a cautious caver dreads. I waited. A normal settling event would either continue to a new equilibrium and stop, or would progress to a full collapse. The pressure on my back did neither. It held, steady and even, at the level it had reached. No further settling, no release, no shift in any direction. I considered whether the ceiling above me was simply a low spot in the crawl that I had forgotten. I rejected this. I had been through the crawl 6 times. I had memorized its features carefully. There was no low spot at 15 feet in. The ceiling at this point in the crawl had always been a comfortable inch or 2 above my back. It had never touched me before. I started to back up. I shifted my hips backward, the way a thin caver moves backward in a belly crawl, using the toes of my boots to push myself slightly toward the entrance. I moved maybe 4 inches. The pressure on my back released by exactly the amount of my motion. I want to be precise about this. The ceiling did not lift off me as I moved. It did not return to its original height above the crawl. The pressure did not disappear. The pressure simply tracked my motion, releasing in proportion to my retreat, as if the rock above me were following me. I moved backward 4 inches. The pressure relaxed by the equivalent of 4 inches of clearance. I moved backward another 4 inches. The pressure relaxed by the equivalent of another 4 inches of clearance. I stopped. I held position again. The pressure held at its new reduced level. The ceiling did not continue to lift. It did not press back down. It was holding, steady, at the new clearance my retreat had given it. I started backing up again. The pressure tracked my motion again. Slowly, evenly, releasing in perfect proportion to the speed of my retreat. I am a software developer. I work professionally with systems that respond to input in measurable, predictable ways. The behavior of the ceiling above me was the behavior of a system that was responding to my movement. It was not the behavior of a static piece of geology. Static geology does not track. Static geology does not release in proportion to your retreat. Static geology either holds in place or shifts independently of you. The ceiling above me was not behaving like static geology. I kept backing up. I wriggled backward through the slight rise at 15 feet, where the pressure had first met me. I moved backward through the small, shallow depression at 8 feet. I worked my way back through the entrance section of the crawl. The pressure tracked me the entire way, releasing slowly and evenly with each shift of my hips, never lifting fully off my back, never returning to the comfortable inch or 2 of clearance I had started with. The ceiling, the entire ceiling, was riding above me at the exact distance my retreat permitted. I came out of the crawl. I came out feet first, as you do when you back out of a crawl, sliding slowly on the silt of the floor until my feet emerged from the entrance and my legs, and finally my torso slid out into the wider passage where Maddox was sitting in his camp chair with his paperback. The pressure released. The pressure did not gradually dissipate. The pressure did not lift slowly. In the moment my upper body cleared the entrance of the crawl, the pressure on my back vanished. Cleanly, completely, as if a switch had been flipped. The ceiling, which had been pressing on me for the entire 15-foot retreat, was no longer pressing on me, and the crawl behind me looked, when I shone my headlamp back into it, exactly as it had always looked. An ordinary belly crawl with the same uneven gray-brown limestone ceiling at the same height it had always been. I lay on my back at the entrance of the crawl, and I stared at the ceiling of the wider passage above me. The ceiling there was about 4 feet up, well above any reasonable risk of pressing down. I felt the air on my face. I felt my own heart beating very fast. I tried to breathe. Maddox had set down his paperback when he had heard me come out. He stood up, he walked over, he looked down at me. He said in a calm voice, "Hey, you okay?" I tried to answer him. I could not. I want to be honest about this. I opened my mouth and I closed it, and I opened it again, and no words came out. I tried to form words and the words did not come. I lay there on the silt of the passage floor, looking up at Maddox's face in the cone of his headlamp beam, and I could not speak. Maddox waited. He did not press me. He did not ask follow-up questions. He waited, the way a good caving partner waits when something has happened to a friend underground that the friend cannot yet describe. He went back to his chair. He pulled it closer to where I was lying. He sat down next to me. He set his paperback on the silt. He waited. I lay on the floor for probably 10 minutes. I do not know exactly. I tried, at intervals, to speak. The words did not come. I felt, the whole time, the absence of the pressure on my back, and the way that absence was somehow more disturbing than the presence had been, because it meant that the thing that had been pressing on me was now not pressing on me, was somewhere I could not see, was off doing whatever it did when it was not tracking my retreat through a low passage. After 10 minutes, I sat up. Maddox waited. I drank some water from my bottle. The water helped. After a few sips, I was able to speak. I said, "Maddox, I am not going back through that crawl." Maddox said, "Okay." I said, "I do not want to talk about it right now. I will tell you what happened when we are back at the truck. Is that all right?" Maddox said, "That is all right." We worked our way back to the entrance through a longer alternate route that bypassed the belly crawl. The route was not on any official map that I knew of, but Maddox knew it from older trips with other club members. It involved a circuitous traverse through a series of small connecting passages that added probably 45 minutes to our exit time. We came up out of the cave at about 1 in the afternoon. We sat in the truck cab with the windows down and the engine off, and I told Maddox what had happened. He listened without interrupting. He did not ask any questions. When I was done, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have not heard of that happening to anybody else. Not in this cave, not in any cave. In the 9 years since, I have not been back to that cave." Maddox passed in the winter of 2022 of an aggressive cancer that none of us saw coming, at the age of 45. I went to his service. I have wondered, in the years since, whether Maddox ever told anyone about that day. I do not think he did. I have not asked his widow. I have continued caving on other systems. I have been through dozens of belly crawls in the years since 2016. None of them has done what the West Virginia crawl did. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the cave was simply telling me to stop coming back in a language that did not use words. I am thinner than I was in Tuo Tucson Sexton. I am 42 years old now, and my weight has stayed about the same. I could still fit through that crawl if I wanted to. I do not want to. I have decided that the 30-foot belly crawl in a small cave in southern West Virginia is not my crawl, and that whatever lay above it on the morning of my 7th trip has the right to be left alone, and that the next time a thin caver pushes through that crawl, I hope, with everything in me, that the ceiling stays where it is supposed to be. I had been a recreational caver for about 8 years, and a serious cave photographer for about 4 by the spring of 2015, having grown up loving photography as a young man and having found, in my late 30s, that the cold, patient discipline of underground photography fit my temperament better than any other kind of camera work I had tried. I was 45 years old that April. My day job was as a manager at a regional grain elevator in eastern Kentucky, work that gave me long stretches of clear thinking and weekends I could mostly count on. And the cave photography had become, in those years, the way I spent most of those weekends. I want to say something about cave photography, because the technical details of the work matter to what I saw and to what I did not understand. Underground photography is not snapshot work. It is long exposure work. The total absence of natural light in a cave means that a photographer has to bring his own light and to leave his shutter open for many seconds while he paints the cave with carefully directed flashes from off-camera strobes. A typical cave photograph in 2015 was a 30-second to 90-second exposure during which the photographer would walk around the chamber with a handheld strobe, firing it from various positions to light the formations and the walls evenly. The result, when the technique was done well, was a beautifully lit photograph that showed the cave the way no human eye could ever actually see it, with details and textures that a single moment of headlamp light could never have revealed. The cave I am writing about was a small horizontal system on a piece of private land in a rural county of eastern Kentucky in the Blue Ridge foothills, about 90 minutes from where I lived. The cave was not a famous one. It was a small mile-long horizontal walking cave with a few side passages, owned by a family that had been letting our small caving club access it for about 20 years on a quiet handshake basis. The cave's main interest, for our club, was a series of beautiful flowstone formations along several of its side passages, formations that had been spared the touristic damage that destroys so much of the visible flowstone in commercial caves. Our club had a small unofficial agreement with the family to keep the cave's location quiet, to limit our visits to small careful trips, and to treat the formations with the respect they deserved. I had been visiting that cave on photography trips for about 3 years. I had a particular fondness for one side passage about 1,000 feet in from the entrance, a small horizontal lead that branched off the main trunk passage and ran for maybe 200 feet before pinching out at a small breakdown. About halfway down the lead, on the right wall, was the most beautiful flowstone formation I had ever found in a cave of that size. It was a curtain formation about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, formed over thousands of years by the slow flow of mineral-laden water down a slight slope of the limestone wall, and it had developed into a translucent sheet of calcite with a delicate ribbed texture that, when properly lit from behind, glowed in a soft amber that no other formation I had ever seen could match. I had photographed the formation maybe a dozen times over the previous 3 years. Each time I had come away with reasonable photographs that did not quite capture what the curtain looked like in person. I had gradually been refining my technique. I had been trying different exposure times. I had been trying different positions for my off-camera strobe. I had been trying different angles for my tripod. I was, in the spring of 2015, working toward what I thought of, half-jokingly, as the definitive photograph of that curtain. The photograph that would finally show what the curtain actually looked like in its full quiet beauty. I drove out to the cave on a Saturday morning in mid-April. I went alone. The club permitted solo trips for experienced members on the cave's standard waiver, and I had filed my surface trip plan with the safety officer the day before. I had told my wife I expected to be home by supper time. I had taken the standard precautions of carrying duplicate light sources and a signaling device. I hiked into the cave at about 10 in the morning. The walking passage of the first 1,000 feet was familiar to me. I reached the side passage with the curtain at about 10:30. I stopped at the entrance to the lead. I drank some water. I checked my camera gear. I checked my off-camera strobe. I checked the small flashes I would use to fire the strobe remotely. I went through my pre-shot mental routine, the careful sequence of checks that a cave photographer goes through before committing to a long exposure. I walked the 100 feet down the lead to the curtain. I set up my tripod about 8 feet from the formation, on the left side of the passage, in the position I had been using on my previous visits. I attached my camera. I set my exposure for 60 seconds at f/8 with a low ISO. I set my off-camera strobe on a small portable stand on the right side of the passage, angled to fire across the curtain from the back, the way I had been doing it on previous trips when I had wanted to bring out the translucent quality of the calcite. I fired the shutter. I walked carefully into position behind the strobe. I fired the strobe twice during the 60-second exposure. The flash was bright in the small space, lighting up the curtain in a sudden pulse of white light each time, and then fading back into the darkness of my low headlamp setting. I closed the shutter at 60 seconds. I checked the back of the camera briefly, the way you check your work in digital photography, but I was actually shooting film for that particular project, because I had decided, for the kind of long exposure photography I wanted to do, that the particular tonal rendering of medium format black and white film would give me the results I was looking for in a way that digital could not. I made a note in my small field notebook of the exposure settings and the strobe positions. I broke down the tripod. I packed the camera. I packed the strobe. I walked out of the cave. I drove home. I got home in the afternoon. I had supper with my wife. I told her the trip had gone fine, that I had taken some good shots of the curtain, that I was looking forward to developing the film the next day. The next day was Sunday. I spent the afternoon in the small darkroom I had set up in our basement. I developed the medium format film I had shot the previous day. I made my first contact prints. The negatives looked good. The exposure had been right. The strobe had fired at the right moments. The curtain was sharp and beautifully lit, with the translucent amber quality I had been working toward for 3 years. I was pleased. I selected the best of the negatives. I made a 16 by 20 enlargement. I worked carefully, doing 2 test strips, dodging the edges slightly to bring out the texture of the limestone walls around the formation. The print took me about an hour. I hung it on a drying line in the darkroom and I went upstairs to make some tea. I came back down to the darkroom about 30 minutes later when the print was dry enough to handle. I took it down from the line. I carried it under the bright examination light at my workbench. I looked at it carefully. The curtain was beautiful, better than any of my previous photographs of it. The translucent calcite was glowing in the soft amber I had been trying to capture, with the ribbed texture clearly visible across its full height. The lighting was even. The composition was good. The print, by any technical measure, was the best photograph I had ever taken of that formation. Behind the curtain, partially obscured by the formation, was the silhouette of a person. I want to describe what I saw very precisely, because I have looked at the photograph many hundreds of times over the 10 years since. The silhouette was the outline of a tall, thin human figure, standing upright, in the section of cave passage immediately behind the curtain formation. The figure was visible in dark contrast against the translucent calcite, the way a person standing behind a frosted glass would be visible in silhouette against the glass when light came through from the side. The figure was, by the proportional reference of the curtain itself, probably 6 feet 4 inches to 6 feet 6 inches tall. The figure was thin, unusually thin. The shoulders were narrow. The arms hung straight down at the sides. The head was visible above the shoulders, a small oval shape against the upper portion of the curtain, with what appeared to be the suggestion of long hair or some other dark mass extending downward from the head to about shoulder level. The figure was facing forward. It was facing me, or it was facing the camera. I could not tell, from the silhouette alone, what direction it was actually oriented. The figure was not moving. The exposure had been 60 seconds long. Any movement during the exposure would have produced a blur in the silhouette. There was no blur. The figure had been standing absolutely still for the entire 60 seconds. I sat down on the stool at my workbench. I held the photograph in my hands. I looked at it for probably 20 minutes. I checked the negative under my loupe. The silhouette was on the negative. It was not an artifact of my printing. It was not a developing error. It was on the original film, which meant that whatever had produced the silhouette had been in the cave at the moment of the exposure. I tried to think. I considered, in the first minute, whether the silhouette might be a feature of the cave I had not previously noticed. A tall, thin column of dark mineral that happened to be standing behind the curtain. I rejected this. I had been to that side passage a dozen times. I had photographed the curtain from various angles on previous trips. The previous photographs, which I had in my files, did not show any dark feature behind the curtain. The wall behind the curtain was a plain limestone face, light gray-brown, with no dark vertical features. I considered whether the silhouette might be a person who had entered the cave behind me, walked into the side passage during my exposure, stood still behind the formation for 60 seconds, and walked back out without my noticing. I rejected this. I had been alone at the curtain. I had been the only person in the cave that day. The walking passage from the entrance to the side lead was not noisy, and a person walking down the passage would have produced footstep sounds and possibly small headlamp glows that would have been unmistakable in the otherwise silent cave. I would have noticed. I had not noticed because there had been nothing to notice. I considered whether the silhouette might be a hallucination, a photographic hallucination, if such a thing existed. I rejected this. The silhouette was on the negative. Negatives do not hallucinate. The negative had captured photons that had come through the lens during the 60-second exposure. Those photons had carried the shape of whatever had been standing behind the curtain. The negative was a faithful record. I could not argue with it. I put the photograph in a folder. I put the folder in the locked bottom drawer of my work desk in my home office. I went upstairs. I did not tell my wife about the photograph that evening. I did not show it to her. I did not show it to anyone in my caving club. I did not show it to any of the photography colleagues I had been corresponding with about the curtain project. I went to bed that night, and I did not sleep well. In the days that followed, I tried to construct a more careful explanation. I considered every possible mechanism that could have produced a silhouette in a long exposure photograph of a cave formation. I considered double exposures. I considered light leaks. I considered chemical contamination during developing. I considered each of these possibilities carefully, and I rejected each of them. The silhouette was a real exposure. Something with the shape of a tall, thin person had been standing behind the curtain during my 60-second shot. After 2 weeks of thinking about the photograph, I decided to go back to the cave and take the same photograph again. I told myself I was doing this for scientific reasons, to test whether the silhouette had been some kind of one-time anomaly. I told myself, more honestly, that I was doing it because I needed to know whether the silhouette would be there a second time, and that I was prepared to accept whatever the second photograph showed me. I drove out to the cave on a Saturday in early May, 2 weeks after the first trip. I went alone again. I walked through the entrance passage. I went down the side lead. I set up my tripod in exactly the position I had used for the first photograph, at the same 8-foot distance from the curtain, on the same left side of the passage. I set up my off-camera strobe in exactly the same position on the right side. I set my camera to exactly the same exposure settings, 60 seconds at f8 with the same ISO. I checked everything twice. I fired the shutter. I walked carefully into position. I fired the strobe twice during the exposure. I closed the shutter at 60 seconds. I broke down my gear. I walked out of the cave. I drove home. I developed the film that night, working until very late in my darkroom. I made the same 16 by 20 enlargement using the same printing technique. I hung it on the drying line. I waited. I took it down. I looked at it. The curtain was beautiful. The lighting was, if anything, slightly better than the first photograph. The translucent calcite glowed in the same soft amber. The ribbed texture was clear across the full height of the formation. Behind the curtain, partially obscured by the formation, was the silhouette of a tall, thin person. The silhouette was in the same position, standing upright, facing forward, 6 feet 4 inches to 6 feet 6 inches tall, thin, narrow shoulders, arms hanging straight down at the sides, head visible above the shoulders, with the same suggestion of long hair or dark mass extending downward to about shoulder level. The silhouette was, as far as I could tell from the side-by-side comparison of the two enlargements, identical to the silhouette in the first photograph. Same height, same posture, same partial obscuring by the formation, same complete absence of motion blur over the 60-second exposure. The figure had been standing in exactly the same place on a Saturday in early May 2015 as it had been standing on a Saturday in mid-April 2015, in a side passage of a small Kentucky cave that was on private land and that had been visited only twice in those 2 weeks, by me, alone, on those 2 specific Saturdays. I put the second photograph in the folder with the first. I locked the drawer. I went upstairs. I did not go back to the cave. I want to say that as plainly as I can. I have not been back to that cave in the 10 years since. I told the safety officer of our caving club, 2 weeks after the second trip, that I was retiring from cave photography for personal reasons. The club was sorry to lose me. I did not give them more details. I have remained on the club's mailing list for a decade. I read the newsletters when they arrive. I do not attend the gatherings. I have made polite excuses every time I have been invited to a trip. The excuses have been accepted without question. The 2 photographs are in the locked drawer at the bottom of my work desk in my home office. I have not opened the drawer in maybe 4 years. I know what is in it. I do not need to look. I am 55 years old now. I have a year or two left before I retire from the grain elevator. I plan to spend my retirement on the surface, taking pictures of waterfalls and of old cabins, working with light that comes from the sun and not from a strobe, photographing things that stand still because they are made of stone and water, and not because they are watching me. I have asked my wife, in the casual way you ask spouses things you do not want to talk about directly, to burn the contents of the bottom drawer of my work desk after my passing, without looking at them. She agreed without asking why. I am grateful for her. I hope it has the curtain. I hope it stays. I had moved to Asheville the summer before, in 2016, for a job as a marketing coordinator at a small outdoor equipment company. And by the summer of 2017, I had been looking, in my first year in Western North Carolina, for the kind of outdoor hobby that the Blue Ridge country was famous for. I was 29 years old that July. I was a competent hiker. I was a poor climber. I had tried whitewater kayaking and had not taken to it. A co-worker at the equipment company had suggested caving, had introduced me to a small caving club based out of Asheville, and I had gone on my first beginner trip with that club in March of 2017. I had taken to it immediately. I had liked the cold, quiet underground light. I had liked the careful, focused way that experienced cavers move through tight passages. I had liked the way the surface world fell away after the first 100 feet of any cave entrance, leaving only the small particular world of the passage in front of you. By that summer, I had done 3 beginner trips with the club. The trip I am writing about was my 4th. It was a small group day trip into a moderate difficulty horizontal cave on a piece of private land in a rural county about an hour north of Asheville, owned by a family that had been letting our club access the cave for about 15 years. The cave was a popular destination for our club's beginner training trips because it offered a good range of typical horizontal cave features without any significant vertical work or any technically dangerous sections. The total in and out trip was about 2.5 miles of underground travel. The expected duration was about 6 hours. There were 9 of us on the trip. The trip leader, a careful, experienced woman in her early 40s named Miranda, who had been with the club for about 10 years and who handled most of our beginner programs. 2 assistant trip leaders, both experienced cavers in their 30s. 6 beginners, of whom I was one. The other 5 beginners were a mix of people in their 20s and 30s, mostly transplants to Asheville who had come to caving the way I had come to it, looking for an outdoor hobby that fit the region. We met at the trailhead at 8 in the morning. Miranda gave us a careful pre-trip briefing. She walked us through the cave's general layout, pointing out the sections we would traverse, explaining the standard procedures for moving in single file, for keeping the right spacing between cavers, for the small communication signals that experienced cavers use in tight passages. The briefing took about 30 minutes. We hiked the 1/4 mile into the cave entrance, suited up, ran our buddy checks, and went underground at about 9. The first 100 feet of the cave was a comfortable walking passage with the kind of dry limestone floor and varied ceiling height that beginners encountered on a trip like this. We moved in single file, with about 5 feet of spacing between cavers. Miranda was at the front of the line. The 2 assistant trip leaders were spaced through the middle and the back of the group. The 6 of us beginners were distributed in an order Miranda had set during the briefing, based on our previous trips and our reported comfort levels with various cave features. I was the 7th person in the line of 9. The caver in front of me was a man in his 60s named Forrest, a retired civil engineer who had moved to Asheville from Florida the previous year and who had been on his first caving trip the previous month. Forrest was tall and lean, and moved through the passage with the careful, slow pace of an older man who had spent a lot of time in his life paying attention to where he put his feet. The caver behind me was a woman in her 50s named Beverly, a retired nurse who had been on her first trip with our club 2 months before. Beverly was shorter than I was, sturdy, with the practical, no-nonsense manner of someone who had spent 35 years in emergency room nursing. Both Forrest and Beverly were good company. I had liked them immediately on the previous trip we had been on together. We worked our way through the first 200 feet of the cave at a comfortable pace. The passage varied between full walking height and occasional low spots, where we had to stoop briefly, but nothing required serious crouching. Miranda kept up a quiet running commentary at the front of the line, pointing out small features of the passage, occasionally stopping the group so that the trailing cavers could catch up. At about 300 feet in, the passage came to a section that the briefing had described as the long crouch. This was a stretch of about 150 feet, where the ceiling dropped to about 4 feet of clearance and required the entire group to move forward in a low crouch position. The long crouch was not the most demanding feature of the cave, but it was the first sustained tight section that we beginners would encounter on the trip, and Miranda had described it carefully during the briefing. She had told us to keep our spacing slightly tighter than usual through the section, to keep our hands on our knees as we walked, and to let her know if we got tired and needed a stop. We entered the long crouch in our standard order. Forrest was about 6 feet ahead of me. Beverly was about 5 feet behind me. The single file line stretched out behind and ahead of us in our crouching positions, headlamps bobbing as we moved. I was about 30 feet into the long crouch when I felt the hand close around my left ankle. I want to describe this very precisely, because I have gone over the sensation many thousands of times in the 8 years since. It was a hand. I want to say that as plainly as I can. It was not a snag of cloth on a piece of rock. It was not a strap of my own gear that had come loose and was catching on something. It was not a bat or any other small animal. It was a human hand, closing around my left ankle, just above the top of my caving boot, with 5 distinct finger pressures clearly differentiated from each other. The thumb pressed against the inside of my ankle. The index finger and the middle finger pressed against the front of my ankle. The ring finger and the small finger pressed against the outside. The palm of the hand rested against the back of my ankle, where the Achilles tendon would have been. The hand was warm. I want to be precise about this. The cave we were in was at the typical 55 degrees of cave air temperature in that region. The hand on my ankle was distinctly warmer than that. It was the temperature of human skin, the warm, steady warmth of a living adult hand. I could feel that warmth through the fabric of my caving suit and through the thin sock I was wearing under my boot. The warmth was unmistakable. The grip was firm, not painful, not tight enough to bruise, but firm in the way an adult's hand is firm when it is holding another person's ankle on purpose, with the steady applied pressure of intentional contact, rather than the loose accidental brush of something that had grazed against me. The hand held me for 3 seconds. I want to describe what happened in those 3 seconds. I had stopped moving forward in the moment the hand closed around my ankle. I had frozen, the way a person freezes in the half-second of confused recognition when something unexpected happens to their body. I tried to look down at my ankle. The crouch position made this difficult. I had to angle my head down and to the left, and my headlamp beam swept across the floor of the passage and across the side of my own boot. I saw, in the beam, my own left boot, the dark fabric of the lower leg of my caving suit, the dry limestone floor of the passage immediately around my boot. There was no hand visible on my ankle. There was no one beside me. There was no one beneath me. There was no one in any position from which a hand could have reached out and grasped my ankle. The passage on both sides of my position was solid, unbroken limestone wall, with no ledge or alcove or opening of any kind that could have hidden a third person. The floor below me was solid, dry limestone. The ceiling above me was solid limestone 4 feet up. I was, by every visual measure available to my headlamp, alone in my space in the passage, with Forrest's boots about 6 feet ahead of me and Beverly's boots about 5 feet behind me. But the hand was on my ankle. I could feel it. I could feel each of the 5 finger pressures distinctly. I could feel the warmth of the palm against my Achilles tendon. I could feel the thumb's pressure on the inside of my ankle. I could feel the steady, firm grip that was holding me where I was. After what I have estimated, in retrospect, to be about 3 seconds, the hand released. The release was not gradual. It was sudden and clean. In one moment, the 5 finger pressures were on my ankle. In the next moment, they were gone. The warmth disappeared. The contact disappeared. My ankle was, in an instant, as untouched as it had been before I entered the long crouch. I jerked my leg. I shouted. I want to be honest about this. I did not handle the moment with any composure. I made a small, loud sound that was not quite a word, halfway between a gasp and a yell, and I lurched forward into Forrest, who was just ahead of me, and who had not yet reacted to my shout. I bumped into his back. He stumbled forward. The caver in front of him stopped. The whole single-file line of 9 cavers came to a halt in the long crouch. Miranda's voice came from the front, raised slightly to carry through the line. She said, "Hold up. Everyone hold position. What is going on back there? I do not remember exactly what I said. I remember trying to explain. I remember saying that something had grabbed my ankle. I remember Forrest, in front of me, looking confused. I remember Beverly, behind me, asking me what had happened. Beverly said, very carefully, "Honey, I did not touch you." I said, "Somebody had their hand on my ankle. They held it for 3 seconds." Beverly said, "Honey, I am 5 feet behind you. I would have to be lying flat on the floor, with my arm extended to reach your ankle. I am crouched up here, the same as you." Forrest, in front of me, said, "I have not stopped moving forward. I am 6 feet ahead. There is no way I could have reached back to your ankle." Miranda, from the front of the line, called back, "Are you all right? Do you need to come out?" Miranda and one of the assistant trip leaders worked their way back along the line and came to where I was, in the middle of the long crouch. They asked me a series of careful questions about what I had felt, what I had seen, what direction the contact had come from. They listened patiently. They did not express skepticism. They did not tell me I was imagining things. The two of them looked at the section of passage around my position, examining the walls and the floor and the ceiling carefully with their headlamps, and they confirmed what I had already seen, which was that there was no opening or ledge or alcove of any kind that could have hidden a third person. The walls were solid. The floor was solid. The ceiling was solid. There was no possibility, by any normal physical mechanism, for a hand to have reached my ankle from any direction other than from the persons of Forrest, who was 6 feet ahead, or Beverly, who was 5 feet behind, neither of whom had been in any position to have done so. Miranda made a careful decision. She told me, in a calm, professional voice, that she did not doubt what I had felt. She told me that we were going to continue the trip slowly, and that she was going to put me directly behind her at the front of the line for the rest of the day, with Beverly and Forrest taking the spots I had been in. She told me that if I wanted to come out at any point, she would walk me out herself. I agreed to continue. I did not want to be the beginner who had ended a trip for a group of 9 on their first hour underground. I wanted very much to keep going and to act as if nothing had happened. We continued the trip. We worked our way through the rest of the long crouch. We went through the deeper sections of the cave. We turned around at the agreed midpoint, and we worked our way back. The trip took about 6 hours, as planned. We came out of the cave at about 3 in the afternoon. We hiked back to the trailhead. We drove back to Asheville. Miranda called me on the phone 2 days later. She asked me how I was doing. I told her I was doing all right. We talked for about 20 minutes. She told me, in a careful voice, that she had been a caver for 25 years, and that she had not had any encounter quite like the one I had described, but that she had heard, over the years, of 2 or 3 other beginners on club trips who had reported something similar. A hand, a grip, a contact in a tight passage where no contact was possible. She told me that she had never put any of those reports in any official document. She told me that she would not put mine in either, if I preferred. She asked me whether I planned to come on the next beginner trip, which was scheduled for the following month. I told her I needed to think about it. I never went back. I did not go on the next trip. I did not respond to the next month's invitation. I did not respond to the ones after that. After about 6 months of polite emails from Miranda checking on me, I sent her a careful note thanking her for her kindness and telling her that I had decided to step back from caving for personal reasons. She responded warmly, told me she understood, and wished me well. She has not contacted me since. I have not been in a cave since. Not a commercial cave, not a tour cave, not any cave. I am 37 years old now. I have continued to live in Asheville. I have continued to work for the same outdoor equipment company. I have a husband I met in 2019 and a young daughter who was born in 2022. I have not told either of them about what happened in the long crouch. My husband knows that I caved briefly when I first moved to Asheville and that I stopped, and he has not pressed me on why. He is the kind of man who lets people have their reasons. What has stayed with me is the hand itself, the sensation of it, the 5 distinct finger pressures, the warmth of the palm against my Achilles tendon, the steady, firm grip that held me for 3 seconds and then released cleanly. I have had the sensation come back to me sometimes, in the moments before I fall asleep. It is not a memory exactly. It is a return of the sensation itself, the warm, steady contact of a hand on my left ankle, in the dark, in the moments when I am drifting between consciousness and sleep. The sensation lasts for a few seconds and then it goes away. It does not come every night. It comes maybe once or twice a month. It has been doing this for 8 years. I have learned to manage the sensation. I have learned to recognize it when it comes, to stay still until it passes, and to not let it disturb my sleep. I have not told anyone about it. I do not plan to. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the warmth of the grip was not an attempt to pull me anywhere, that it was simply contact, the way a person might briefly hold the ankle of another person who was passing by, just to acknowledge their passage. I have hoped, on the worst nights, that the small return of the sensation in the moments before I fall asleep is not a remembered contact, but a present one, reaching out to me across whatever distance separates the cave from my bedroom in Asheville. I am tired. I am going to bed now. I will lie down and I will close my eyes and I will wait for sleep. And I will wait, also, to see whether the hand returns tonight. It usually does on the nights I think about it. I had been an industrial archaeologist for about 20 years. By the fall of 2020, having gone back to graduate school in my late 20s after a decade in commercial coal mine surveying, and I was 47 years old that October when a small regional historical society hired me to do a complete archaeological survey of a particular abandoned mine in a remote Blue Ridge drainage of a county in southern West Virginia. My academic work had focused on the small abandoned mining operations of southern West Virginia and southwestern Virginia, the hundreds of small drift mines and slope mines and shaft mines that had operated through the early and middle 20th century and that had closed quietly as the larger operations consolidated the industry. I had built a small reputation in the field for careful documentation work in difficult terrain, and the Historical Society had come to me with the kind of project that would have been turned down by larger contractors. The mine I am writing about was a small drift operation that had been worked from approximately 1908 until 1953, when it had closed permanently after a small fatal accident. The operation had never been a large one. At its peak, in the 1920s, it had employed about 90 men. By the late 1940s, the seam had been mostly worked out, and the company that owned it had been preparing to close the mine for several years before the accident provided the final practical reason. After the accident, the company had sealed off the section where it had occurred and had decommissioned the rest of the mine over the following 6 months. The land had been sold to a timber company. The timber company had let the mine sit for 60-some years. In the early 2010s, a small caving organization had become interested in the abandoned mine after a member's grandfather had mentioned it as a place he had heard about as a boy. The organization had obtained permission from the timber company to inspect the entrance and had found that the main drift mouth was still passable, with the original company gate rusted away and the upper sections of the mine reasonably stable. By 2020, they had documented about 3 miles of passage and had identified the rough location of the section that had been sealed off in 1953. The Historical Society had hired me to do a complete archaeological survey of the documented sections of the mine, with the additional assignment of attempting to reach the sealed 1953 section if it could be done safely. They were interested in the small fatal accident for the same reasons that small fatal accidents always interest local historical societies, which is to say that the 4 men who had been killed in 1953 had been local men, and that their families were still in the county, and that the Historical Society had received occasional requests over the decades for any documentation that might exist about the accident. The 4 men killed had been a small advance crew working a new exploratory drift at the back of the mine when a localized roof collapse had killed them where they stood. The mine company had recovered 3 of the 4 bodies in the days after the accident. The 4th body had not been recovered. The company had decided, after consulting with the families, that the cost of further recovery work was prohibitive and that the section would be sealed and the man left where he lay. The families had agreed. The man's name had been Russell Hatfield. He had been 26 years old. He had left a wife and 2 small children. The wife had remarried in 1958 and had passed in 1989. The children had grown up and moved away and were no longer reachable as far as the Historical Society had been able to determine. I drove out to the mine on a Monday morning in mid-October 2020. I met the caving organization's president, a careful man in his 60s named Russell, at a small turnoff at the base of the drainage. He led me up the drainage on a narrow, rough road for about 3 miles, to a small, cleared area where the mine entrance opened into the side of a hill. The entrance was a sturdy old timber-framed adit set into a limestone outcrop, with the original company name still faintly visible on a weathered wooden plaque above the entrance. I want to note here, because it has come to mean something to me in the 5 years since, that the caving organization president was named Russell, the same name as the man who had not been recovered in 1953. He was not a relative of that Russell. The name was a regional coincidence, the kind that happens when a county has a small number of family names that recur across generations. Russell, the caving organization president, walked me through the entrance and gave me a thorough briefing on the mine's known passages. He showed me where the standard caving organization had set up a ledger book at a small, dry alcove just inside the entrance, where members signed in and out for any visit. He showed me where the documented passages diverged from the original mine layout, with the older passages mostly stable and the newer exploratory drifts requiring more caution. He pointed out the rough location, on the small hand-drawn map he gave me, of the 1,953 section, which the organization had identified by working backward from old company surveys, but had not yet attempted to access. He gave me his cell phone number, which would not work inside the mine but would work at the entrance if I came up to call. He told me to be careful. He shook my hand. He drove back down the drainage. I worked the mine alone for the next 2 days. The work was straightforward archaeological documentation. I photographed the visible features of each section. I measured passage dimensions. I cataloged remnant equipment, the rusted rail track, the abandoned coal cars, the hand-set timber supports that had not yet collapsed. I took careful field notes. I followed the organization's standard caving protocols. I signed in and out at the entrance ledger every time. The first 2 days were uneventful. On the 3rd day, Wednesday, I made my way back to the section of the mine that the organization had identified as the rough location of the sealed 1,953 drift. The section was at the back of the documented passages, about a mile in from the entrance, in a part of the mine where the rail track ended and the drifts narrowed into the kind of cramped, exploratory work that mines did in their final years. The organization had not been able to find the original 1,953 seal. The seal had presumably been a mortared brick or concrete wall that the company had erected at the access point of the collapsed drift, but the precise location had been lost over the decades, and the organization had never had the resources to do a systematic search for it. I worked carefully through the back drifts that morning. I had a hand-drawn approximation of where the seal should be, based on the company's old surveys. I checked each side passage carefully, looking for signs of an old wall, or for any irregularity in the rock that might indicate a hidden access point. I had been doing this for about 3 hours, when I came to a small crawl off the main back drift that was not on any of the maps I had been given. I want to describe the crawl carefully. It was a small horizontal opening at the base of the right wall of the main drift, about 3 feet wide and 2 feet high, partially hidden behind a small pile of breakdown that had accumulated against the wall over the decades. I would not have noticed it except that I was looking specifically for irregularities. The breakdown looked recently shifted, not freshly so, maybe a year or 2 of settling, but shifted enough that the small crawl behind it had become marginally accessible. I shone my headlamp into the crawl. The crawl extended for about 10 or 15 feet and appeared to open into a chamber on the other side. I considered, briefly, whether I should go through. I was alone in the mine. I was deep in a back section that the caving organization had not fully documented. I was about to enter a passage that was not on any map. I went through. I want to admit that. I should have gone back to the entrance, called Russell, told him what I had found, and waited for a follow-up trip with proper backup. I did not. I was an experienced industrial archaeologist. I had the protective gear I needed. I had my emergency kit. I had my satellite messenger, which would not work underground, but which I had set to ping my position every hour through a relay scheme I had set up with my wife on the surface. I crawled through. The crawl was tight but manageable. I came out into a chamber. The chamber was about 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a roughly oval shape and a low arched ceiling about 8 feet high at the center. The walls were the typical sandstone and shale of the coal mine country, with the visible black streaks of the coal seam running along the lower portions. The floor was dry, with a thin layer of fine coal dust over packed clay. The chamber was a section of mine that had clearly been worked in the past. There were remnants of an old rail track running along one wall. There was a small collapsed timber support along the far side. There were the small abandoned tools of mining work scattered around the floor, a hand pick, a small shovel, the rusted handle of a coal hammer. Against the right wall of the chamber, on a low natural ledge of sandstone about 4 feet off the floor, was a row of helmets. The helmets were old miners' hard hats of the kind that had been standard issue in the coal mines of southern West Virginia from approximately the 1910s through the 1950s. They were the heavy leather and canvas helmets that had preceded the modern plastic hard hats, with the small brass mounting bracket at the front for a carbide lamp. Each helmet had its carbide lamp still mounted, the brass fixtures in various states of patina but all clearly intact. The leather of the helmets was old and worn, with the dark patina of helmets that had been used in working mines and that had absorbed the sweat and the coal dust of long shifts. There were 47 helmets. I want to be precise about that number. I counted them 3 times. I made notation in my field book each time. 47 helmets, arranged in a single tidy row along the natural sandstone ledge, evenly spaced, with about 6 inches between each helmet. The row was about 30 feet long, occupying most of the available length of the ledge. Each helmet had a small brass plate affixed to the front, just above the lamp bracket. The plates were small, maybe 1.5 inches wide, and each one had a name engraved on it in fine, careful lettering. The kind of brass plate that a mine company sometimes provided to its older employees as a recognition of long service, or the kind that a working man might commission himself from a local shop to display his name on his personal helmet. The plates were free of corrosion. I want to be very precise about that. The brass of the helmet lamp brackets and the small fittings around the helmets had the patina of 70 years of mine air. The dull greenish oxidation that develops on old brass in damp conditions. The brass plates with the names did not have that patina. They were polished. They were clean. They were the bright yellow gold of brass that has been recently polished by hand with a careful cloth. Every single one of the 47 plates was in this condition. I want to describe the helmet's overall condition more broadly. The leather and canvas of the helmets themselves had the wear of 70-year-old mine equipment. They had not been polished. They were dusty, but they were not as dusty as they should have been. The thin layer of coal dust that covered the rest of the chamber, the fine black particulate that settled on every surface in an abandoned mine, was lighter on the helmets than it was on the surrounding ledge. The helmets had been touched recently. They had been handled. Somebody had been in this chamber, within the last few weeks at most, and had cleaned the brass plates with a careful cloth, and had wiped down the helmets, and had returned them to their tidy row. I did not touch the helmets. I want to say that as plainly as I can. I stood in front of the row, with my headlamp pointed across the line of 47 helmets, and I read each of the brass plates carefully without touching any of them. I copied each name into my field book in the order I read them. I worked left to right along the ledge. I took careful notes. I checked my spelling. I noted any names that were unusual. The names were ordinary southern West Virginia names: Riggleman, Morgan, Hatfield, Bryant, Caldwell, Mullins, Adkins, Hensley, the kind of family names that filled the cemeteries and the church rolls of the small mining towns in that part of the state. 47 names, in a row, on 47 brass plates, on 47 old miners' helmets that should not have been polished and should not have been clean. I crawled back out of the chamber. I returned to the main back drift. I worked my way back through the documented passages of the mine. I came up to the entrance about 3 hours later. I signed out of the ledger. I drove back to the small motel in town where I was staying. I ate a quiet supper at a diner, I went to bed early. I did not sleep. I did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called the Historical Society. I told the executive director that I had found a small chamber off the back drift that I needed to do additional research on before I could write it up. I told her I would need to access the company's old employment records, which had been donated to a regional university archive in the 1970s after the company had ceased to exist. She agreed without hesitation. I drove to the regional university archive that afternoon. I spent the next 4 days in the archive, working slowly through the old employment records of the company that had owned the mine. The records were extensive. The company had kept good employment files, with names, dates of hire, dates of separation, and reasons for separation. I cross-referenced each of the 47 names from the brass plates against the records. 43 of the names matched men who had worked at the mine at some point during its operating years. All 43 of those men had separated from the company by retirement. All of them, by the records I could find, had lived to old age and had passed of natural causes in the decades after their retirement. The most recent of the 43 retirements had been in 1952, the year before the mine closed. The earliest had been in 1923. The 43 retired men had been a representative cross-section of the mine's long-term employees, the careful, steady working men who had spent their careers in that small operation and had retired to live out their days in the small towns around the mine. 4 of the names matched men who had been killed in the 1953 accident: Russell Hatfield, Cecil Bryant, Howard Caldwell, Walter Riggleman. I sat in the regional university archive on the afternoon of my 4th day of research, with my notebook open and my pencil in my hand, and I tried to think. I considered whether the helmets had been a memorial display, set up by the families or by the mine company in the immediate aftermath of the accident. I rejected this. The chamber I had found had been off a small crawl that the breakdown had only recently shifted to allow access. The chamber was deep in the back of the mine, in a section that had been sealed off in 1953 and had not been accessible since. There was no plausible mechanism by which a memorial display could have been set up in that chamber after 1953. I considered whether the helmets had been left in the chamber by the men themselves at some point before the 1953 accident as some kind of small private practice. I considered whether the 4 men killed in 1953 had been men who, in the moments before the collapse, had been bringing their own 4 helmets to the chamber to add them to the row, and that the collapse had occurred while they were doing so, and that their helmets had ended up in the row alongside the helmets of their predecessors. I considered, finally, that the helmets had been polished recently, within the last few weeks, by somebody who had access to a chamber that should not have been accessible to anyone since 1953. I closed the archive boxes. I packed up my notebook. I drove back to my motel. I did not return to the mine. I called the Historical Society's executive director the next morning. I told her, in a careful voice, that the chamber I had found had turned out to be a minor feature, the remnants of some kind of small private storage arrangement by the mine workers, and that I did not believe it warranted detailed documentation in my final report. I told her that the section of the mine that had been sealed in 1953 was, as far as I had been able to determine, still inaccessible, and that further work to attempt to reach it would be beyond the scope of the contracted survey. The executive director thanked me. She asked no follow-up questions. I filed the report 2 months later. The report described the documented sections of the mine in detail. It made no mention of the chamber off the back drift. It made no mention of the row of helmets. In the 5 years since, I have not returned to that mine. I have not contacted Russell, the caving organization's president, since I sent him a polite final email thanking him for his assistance with the survey. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that whoever has been polishing those brass plates has been doing so out of love. I have hoped that the practice is a quiet, careful one, performed by some hand I cannot identify, that has been keeping that row of names clean for the 70-some years since the mine was sealed. I have hoped that Russell Hatfield, whose body was never recovered from the 1953 collapse, and whose helmet was somehow on the ledge, alongside his 3 fellow victims and his 43 retired colleagues, is at peace in some way I do not understand. I have my own helmet, an old brass-fitted leather hard hat that I bought at an antique shop in Lewisburg in 2014 as a small archaeological keepsake. I keep it on a shelf in my office. I have noticed, in the last year or two, that the brass on my helmet seems to develop a slightly less aggressive patina than I would expect for a piece of working-age mine equipment from the 1940s. I have not put a brass plate with my name on it on the front. I do not intend to. I look at the helmet sometimes from across the room. I do not pick it up. I do not polish it. I hope, with everything in me, that nobody else is doing that work for me in the dark. I had been a vertical caver for about 22 years by the spring of 2021, mostly with a regional caving organization based out of central Kentucky, and I was 51 years old that April when I drove out to a small cave on a piece of private timberland in a remote drainage of the Blue Ridge country of eastern Kentucky to do a routine solo pit drop. My day job was as a high school chemistry teacher at a small public high school in a county southwest of Lexington. The teaching schedule gave me long summer breaks and reliable weekends, and the vertical caving had been the main weekend occupation of my adult life since my early 30s. I had logged probably 600 trips by that spring, including over 100 solo pit drops. I had taught vertical work to several generations of younger cavers in our organization. I was the kind of caver who had been doing the work long enough to have stopped being impressed by it, who had developed the careful, steady habits of a person who knew that vertical caving punishes carelessness and rewards patience. The cave I am writing about was a small system on a piece of private timberland in a remote Blue Ridge drainage of eastern Kentucky, on a property whose owner had a long arrangement with our organization. The cave was not famous. It was a small pit cave with a single 90-foot vertical drop at the entrance, opening into a horizontal walking passage at the bottom that ran for about a quarter mile through a series of small chambers before pinching out at a small breakdown. The cave had been mapped by our organization in the 1980s. It had been visited periodically over the years by club members for both recreational drops and minor maintenance surveys. The bottom passage held a few small flowstone formations that were the cave's only real features of interest. The pit at the entrance was a clean 90-foot vertical drop. It had a single permanent expansion bolt set into the limestone of the rim, placed there in the early 1990s by a member of our organization who had been particular about the rigging. The bolt was a heavy stainless steel anchor, rated for vertical caving loads, and our organization had inspected it on a regular basis over the decades. The bolt was the standard rigging point for the cave. Solo cavers like me used it by clipping their own ropes through it, descending into the pit, completing whatever work they had planned at the bottom, and climbing back out on their own ropes. I drove out to the cave on a Saturday morning in early April. I had filed my surface trip plan with our organization's safety officer the previous evening, and I had told my wife when to expect me back and what to do if I had not made the agreed phone in time. I had given the property owner a polite call that morning to confirm that I would be on the property. He told me, as he always told me, to be careful and to call him if I needed anything. He was an older man in his 80s, named Boyd, a retired school teacher himself, the kind of mountain landowner who had been generous to our organization out of a quiet pride in his land and a desire to know what was on it. I hiked the half-mile from the small parking pull-off to the pit entrance. The morning was cool and bright. The forest around the pit was just starting to show the early green of spring buds. I reached the rim at about 9 in the morning. I set up my rigging carefully, the way I always did. I clipped my own rope through the permanent bolt. I tied my standard backup, a long sling, around a substantial oak tree, about 15 feet from the rim, with the sling's other end clipped to my rope as a redundant anchor. I checked my rigging twice. I checked my harness. I checked my rappel rack, my ascenders, my safety lanyards, my helmet, my primary and backup lights. I went through the slow, careful pre-drop sequence of a solo vertical caver who had been through it many hundreds of times. I started down at about 9:30. The rappel was clean. I controlled my speed carefully, the way I always did on a long drop. I reached the bottom of the pit at about 9:45. I unclipped from my rope. I let the rope hang where it was, the way you do when you intend to come back to it. The base of the 90-foot drop opened into a small natural chamber about 30 feet across, with the rope hanging down through a small vertical fissure in the ceiling. From the chamber, a low passage led off to the south, opening within 10 feet into the wider walking passage that ran for the quarter-mile of horizontal cave behind the pit. I had been to the bottom of this pit 5 times before over the previous 12 years. I knew the layout. I knew where I was going. I worked the horizontal passage for about 2 hours. I was doing a small follow-up survey on a minor question that our organization's mapping committee had raised about a side lead near the back of the cave. The work was uneventful. I took my measurements. I made my notes. I photographed the small features of interest. I worked at a steady pace, and I finished the documentation by about 11:30. I started back toward the pit at about 11:45. I worked my way through the horizontal passage, came back into the chamber at the base of the drop, and looked up at the rope. There were 2 ropes hanging from the bolt. I want to describe what I saw very precisely, because I have gone over the moment many thousands of times in the 4 years since. My own rope was hanging from the bolt where I had left it. It was a modern 11mm static caving rope in a particular blue and yellow pattern that the manufacturer had put out in the late 2010s. I knew it on sight. I had bought it new in 2018. I had used it on probably 40 drops since I had bought it. The rope was hanging straight down from the bolt, with the standard small loops of slack at the bottom that I had left for the climb out, with my ascender bag clipped to the rope where I had left it, with my chest harness sling looped through the rope at chest height where I had left it. My rope was exactly as I had left it. Beside my rope, hanging from the same bolt, was a second rope. The second rope was an old hemp rope. I want to describe it carefully. It was the kind of laid hemp climbing rope that had been used by recreational cavers in the southern Appalachians from approximately the late 1930s through the early 1960s, before the introduction of synthetic kern mantle ropes had made hemp obsolete for vertical work. It was a 3-strand twisted rope, about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, of the slightly yellowed natural fiber color that aged hemp takes on after many years of use. It had the small, fuzzy texture that hemp ropes develop with age, where the outer fibers begin to fray slightly with handling. The hemp rope was hanging from the bolt at the top of the pit, 90 feet up. The lower end of the rope hung within easy reach of my hand. The rope passed through the bolt the way a rope passes through any anchor point. It was tied off at the top with what appeared, from 90 feet down, to be a standard bowline of the kind that cavers had used for decades. The rope was strong. I could see, from the way it hung straight down without any sag or any twist, that it was bearing its own weight properly, the way a competent rope bears its own weight. It was not a relic that had been hanging in the cave for decades. It was a working rope, a rope that, by every visual measure I could make from 90 feet down, was tied off correctly at the top, was ready to bear a load, and had been hung within easy reach of a person at the bottom of the pit who might want to use it. I want to describe my state of mind in the next several minutes. I was a 51-year-old chemistry teacher who had been doing vertical caving for 22 years, who had taught vertical work to younger cavers, who had developed the careful, steady habits of a long-time solo pit caver. I had been alone in this cave for 2.5 hours. The bolt at the top of the pit had only one attachment point. I had clipped my own rope to that single attachment point. There was no mechanism by which a second rope could have been added to that bolt while I was at the bottom of the pit. There had been no other person in the cave with me. The pit was the only entrance. Anybody who wanted to add a rope to the bolt would have had to walk past me on the surface trail, descend to the rim, and tie off a rope, all while I was working at the bottom. None of those things had happened. The hemp rope was, by every measure I could apply to it, hanging from a bolt that physically could not have a second rope tied to it. I stood at the bottom of the pit, and I looked up at the 2 ropes for probably a full minute. I did not move. I did not call out. I did not try to touch the hemp rope. I held still, and I tried to think. My first instinct was to back away from the rope. I want to admit that. The careful, disciplined chemistry teacher part of my mind, the part that had spent 22 years following solo vertical caving protocols, was telling me to back away from the hemp rope, to clip into my own rope, to start the climb out as quickly as I safely could, and to not under any circumstance touch the second rope. I followed that instinct. I clipped into my own rope. I started up. I climbed the 90 feet of vertical rope in about 35 minutes, which was slow even for a man my age. Because I was being unusually careful and because I was not letting myself look across at the hemp rope as I climbed. I was on my own rope. I was using my own ascenders. I was moving in the standard frog walk technique that solo vertical cavers use, with my chest ascender and my foot ascender alternately taking my weight as I worked my way up. The climb was not difficult. I had done many climbs of similar length. I was tired but not exhausted. The hemp rope hung beside me the entire time. I could feel it in my peripheral vision. I could feel its presence the way you feel the presence of a person standing very close to you that you are not looking at. I did not turn my head toward it. I did not let my gear brush against it. I climbed straight up my own rope, slowly and steadily, the way a careful caver climbs. I reached the top of the pit at about 1:15 in the afternoon. I clipped into my safety bolt at the rim. I unclipped from my rope. I pulled myself up over the edge of the pit. I sat on the limestone of the rim for probably a minute, catching my breath. Then I looked at the bolt. The bolt was the same bolt I had rigged that morning. The single permanent expansion bolt, set into the limestone, with my own rope tied to it through a single carabiner, with my backup sling running from my rope to the oak tree 15 feet away. There was no second rope. The bolt had a single attachment point. The single attachment point had my carabiner clipped through it. My carabiner had my own rope on it. There was no other rope tied to the bolt. There was no other carabiner clipped to the bolt. There was no other anchor sling around any other tree on the rim. There was nothing on the rim that suggested any second rope had ever been there. I stood up. I walked carefully around the rim of the pit. I checked the entire perimeter for any sign of a second anchor point. I checked the substantial trees near the rim for any sling that might have been tied to one of them. I checked the limestone rim for any other bolt or natural anchor that I might have overlooked. I found nothing. I walked back to my rigging. I knelt at the edge of the pit. I looked down. My own rope hung straight down the 90 feet of the pit, the blue and yellow pattern visible all the way down to the chamber at the bottom. There was no second rope. The hemp rope was gone. The pit looked, from the rim, exactly as a pit looks when a single solo caver has rigged a single rope through a single bolt and is about to break down their gear and go home. I broke down my gear. I want to admit that I did this faster than I usually do. I pulled the rope up. I coiled it. I packed my ascenders. I removed the backup sling from the oak tree. I packed everything into my caving pack. I shouldered the pack. I hiked out of the cave property. I drove home that afternoon. I called my wife on the way to confirm that I was out of the cave and headed back. I did not tell her about the second rope. I did not tell her that night when I got home. I have not told her in the 4 years since. I did call our organization's safety officer the next day. I had been thinking about it overnight. I told him, in a careful voice, that I had a hypothetical question for him. I asked him whether, in his many decades with our organization, he had ever heard of a vertical caver finding a second rope hanging from a known single anchor pit bolt at the bottom of a drop, with the second rope being absent when the caver returned to the top. The safety officer was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a careful voice, "Why do you ask?" I said, "It is just a hypothetical." He said, "I have heard of 1 or 2 reports along those lines over the years. I do not know what to make of them. I have not put any of them in any official record." I said, "From what cave?" He said, "I would prefer not to say." I said, "Did either of those cavers climb out on the rope they had not rigged themselves?" The safety officer was quiet again, longer this time. Then he said, "One of them did, many years ago, a man I knew personally." I said, "What happened to him?" He said, "He did not come back." He paused. He said, "I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because you have asked." The man who climbed out on the rope he had not rigged was an experienced solo caver who had been with our organization since the 1960s. He was last seen on a Saturday morning in the spring of 1994, hiking in toward a cave he had been visiting for years. His vehicle was found at the parking pull-off. His body was never recovered. The bolt at the top of his cave had no second attachment point when the search team reached the rim. There was no second rope. We do not know what happened to him. We have never put any of this in writing. I am asking you, as a personal favor, not to put it in writing either. And I am asking you, with all the seriousness I can manage, to never climb out of any pit on a rope you did not rig yourself. I said, I did not. He said, "Thank God for that." Sown. We did not speak again about the matter. I have continued to be an active member of our organization for the 4 years since. I have continued to do vertical work. I have done probably 40 pit drops in the years since 2021, all of them in caves other than the one I am writing about. I have not gone back to that small cave on Boyd's property in eastern Kentucky. I went to Boyd's funeral in the summer of 2023. He had passed in his sleep at the age of 85, a peaceful death of natural causes. The land was inherited by his son, who lives in Lexington. The son has given our organization permission to continue accessing the cave under the same terms his father had set. The cave has been visited a few times by other club members in the years since my last trip. None of them, as far as I have heard, has reported anything unusual. I have thought many times about the hemp rope. I have thought about who tied it to the bolt while I was at the bottom of the pit. I have thought about how the rope appeared on a bolt with a single attachment point. I have thought about whether the rope was ever physically present in the way I understood physical presence, or whether it was something else, something that took the appearance of a working rope as part of whatever it was doing in that pit. I have thought about what would have happened if I had clipped my ascenders to the hemp rope. I have thought about whether the rope would have held my weight for the climb. I have thought about whether it would have held me for the first 10 feet, or the first 30 feet, or the first 80 feet, before something happened that I would not want to think about. I have thought about the man the safety officer mentioned, the experienced solo caver from 1994, and about whether he had perhaps thought the hemp rope was a small kindness from a previous caver who had left a second line as a backup, and about whether he had clipped to it because he had been tired at the end of a long day, and the second rope had been right there beside his own, and he had decided, casually, to use it. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the man from 1994 did not suffer for very long after he committed his weight to the hemp rope, and that whatever happened to him in the time between his clip-in and the search team's arrival at the empty pit was not a long thing. I have not gone back to that cave. I do not intend to. There are many caves in eastern Kentucky, and many bolts that have only one attachment point, and many ropes that hang exactly where they should hang, and I am grateful, every time, when the only rope I find at the rim is the rope I tied there myself. I had been a cave surveyor for about 19 years by the summer of 2022, mostly with a regional caving organization based out of Cookeville, Tennessee, and I was 49 years old that July. My day job was as a structural engineer for a small consulting firm in Knoxville, work that suited my temperament and gave me the weekends I needed for serious cave survey work. I had been a methodical, careful surveyor over those 19 years, the kind of person who cross-checked his measurements twice and who read every previous survey report on a cave before he ever went underground in it. I was not the kind of person who tended to embellish what he experienced in caves. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because what I am about to describe is not a thing I have ever told anyone outside of two people, and one of those people was the man who was with me when it happened. The cave I am writing about was a small horizontal system on a piece of private land in a rural county of the Blue Ridge country of Middle Tennessee. The cave had been in our organization's survey records for about 30 years. It had been mapped in detail in the early 1990s by a careful team of 3 surveyors, and the master map of the system was considered reliable. The total surveyed length was about 1.25 miles of horizontal walking passage, with a few small side leads, and one section near the back where the original survey team had documented a continuation passage that they had not had time to push during their 1990s work. The continuation passage was marked on the master map as a future work item. The trip I am writing about was a follow-up survey to push that continuation passage to its conclusion. Our organization had been working through a backlog of small, unfinished items in our Tennessee survey records, closing out the small future work notes that had accumulated over the decades. And the continuation passage in this particular cave had come up on the schedule for the summer of 2022. I had been assigned to the trip with one of my regular survey partners, a man named Garrett, who was a few years younger than I was. Garrett worked as a cartographer for the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and he had been my survey partner on probably 40 trips over the previous decade. We had the kind of careful underground shorthand that long survey partners develop. We trusted each other. He was the kind of man who did not need a lot of conversation underground and who could be relied on to do his part of the work without having to be reminded. We met at the trailhead at 7 in the morning on a Saturday in mid-July. The morning was already warm in the way Tennessee summer mornings are already warm, with the cicadas starting up in the trees around the small parking pull-off and the air heavy with humidity. We hiked the half-mile into the cave entrance, suited up, ran our pre-trip checks, and went underground at about 8. The hike to the chamber where the continuation passage was supposed to begin took us about an hour through walking passage. We reached the chamber at about 9. I want to describe the chamber. It was a small natural room about 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a flat ceiling about 10 feet high and a relatively level floor of dry limestone covered with a thin layer of cave silt. The walls were the typical limestone of the region, with a few small flowstone deposits along the lower portions and a single small calcite formation near the back wall. The chamber had 2 entrances and, according to the 1990s master map, a third opening at the back where the continuation passage was supposed to begin. The third opening by the map was marked as a low arched gap about 4 feet wide and 3 feet high in the back wall of the chamber. We walked across the chamber to the back wall. The back wall was a solid, unbroken bedrock face. There was no opening in it. There was no gap. There was no passage continuation. There was no indication that any passage had ever existed at the back of the chamber. The wall was the same gray-brown limestone as the rest of the chamber, with the same small flowstone deposits along its lower portion, and it ran from floor to ceiling with no break of any kind. Garrett and I stood in front of the wall for probably a full minute. Neither of us spoke. I pulled out the master map and unfolded it carefully. I checked the map against the chamber. We were in the right chamber. The 2 visible entrances matched the map's 2 documented entrances. The orientation of the chamber matched the map's orientation. Our position, by the GPS coordinates I had recorded at the entrance, and the careful track we had been keeping on the way in, was the position the map indicated for the chamber. The third opening, the future work continuation passage, did not exist. I considered, in the first minute, whether the 1990s survey team had made an error in their map. This was possible. Old surveys sometimes contained mistakes. But the 1990s team had been a careful one, and I had read their original notes the previous week as part of my preparation. The notes had been clear. The continuation passage had been observed in 1992 by all 3 members of that survey team, who had documented it in their field log and had marked it on their preliminary sketch as a future work item because they had been running short of time on the trip and had decided to leave its survey for a future visit. The notes had described the opening in some detail. A low-arched gap about 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, with the suggestion of a continuing passage visible through the opening in the team's headlamp beams. I considered whether the wall in front of us had been the result of a relatively recent breakdown event that had collapsed the entrance to the continuation passage and had filled it with rubble that subsequent calcite deposition had cemented over. I rejected this. The wall had no signs of recent breakdown. The flowstone deposits on the wall had the consistent surface patina of features that had been growing for hundreds or thousands of years, with no fresh fractures or recent disturbances. The wall looked, by every measure I could apply to it, like a wall that had been there for the entire geological lifespan of the chamber. I considered, finally, that the 1990s survey team had been mistaken about what they had seen in 1992. Maybe the continuation passage had been a trick of headlamp shadow. Maybe the opening they had documented had never been a real passage, but had been some smaller feature that had looked like a passage in their dim caving lights. This was the most plausible, ordinary explanation, and it was the one I was leaning toward as I unfolded my notebook to begin documenting the wall. Garrett said, "I am going to sit down for a minute. My back is bothering me." I said, "All right." Garrett sat down on a small flat slab of limestone that protruded from the floor near the center of the chamber, about 10 feet from where I was standing at the back wall. He pulled his water bottle out of his pack and took a long drink. I started sketching the wall. I had begun the standard documentation procedure for a closed terminal feature, drawing the wall's profile and its dimensions, when the first knocks came. I want to describe what we heard very precisely. There were 3 knocks. The knocks came from the wall directly in front of me, from inside the limestone, at the same height as my head, about 3 feet to my right of the position where I was sketching. The knocks were loud enough to be unambiguous. They were not faint. They were not on the edge of audibility. They were clear, measured knocks of the kind that an adult human knuckle makes against a solid surface, with the small ringing resonance that a knock produces when it strikes against a stone wall. The 3 knocks came in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. The pauses between the knocks were each about 1.5 seconds long. The 3 knocks together took about 4 seconds. After the 3rd knock, silence. I had been kneeling at the wall with my notebook in my hand and my pencil in mid-stroke. I froze. My pencil stopped where it was on the page. I did not move my head. I did not move my hand. I did not breathe for what felt like several seconds. Garrett, behind me, did not speak. I could hear him not breathing. I could hear his complete stillness on the slab where he had been sitting. I want to be precise about what was wrong with the knocks. The knocks had come from inside the wall, from inside the bedrock, from a depth that I could not estimate, but which had to be at least several inches behind the visible surface of the limestone, and which might have been considerably deeper than that. The knocks had been clearly internal to the rock, the way a knock on the other side of a wooden door is clearly on the other side of the door. They had been knocks coming through the wall, from a position behind it, made by something that was on the far side of the limestone face I was sketching. I did not turn around. I did not raise my voice. I said, in a level, low voice, "Garrett, tell me you heard that." Garrett said, "I heard it." I said, "Where did it come from?" Garrett said, "From the wall in front of you, from inside it, about the height of your head." I said, "Yes." We did not move. We did not speak again for probably a full minute. I held my position at the wall with my pencil still on the page. Garrett held his position on the slab. The chamber around us was completely silent. The only sounds were the slow drip of water from the ceiling somewhere ahead of us in the cave passage and the faint, very distant sound of my own pulse in my ears. After about a minute, the second set of knocks came. I want to describe them. They came from the same position as the first 3, the same height, the same approximate location 3 feet to my right of where I was kneeling, the same volume, the same slow, deliberate rhythm of 3 knocks separated by 1.5 second pauses. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. The same 4-second total duration. After the 3rd knock, silence again. I want to describe what I understood in that second silence. I understood that whatever had made the first 3 knocks had waited. It had waited a measured amount of time. It had then made the same 3 knocks again, in exactly the same rhythm. The first 3 knocks had been a signal. The signal had been sent, the signal had received no response, and the signal had been repeated. If the signal had been waiting for a response, the signal was waiting to see whether a response would come on the second attempt. I did not knock back. I want to say that as plainly as I can. I made a small, careful decision in the silence after the second 3 knocks. I decided that I was not going to knock the wall. I was not going to make any sound that might be interpreted as an answering signal. I was not going to communicate, in any direction, with whatever had made the knocks. I closed my notebook very slowly. I capped my pencil. I put the notebook in my chest pocket. I stood up slowly. I turned around. Garrett was on his feet. He had stood up at some point during the silence between the 2 sets of knocks, without making any sound. His pack was on his shoulder, his helmet was on, his headlamp was pointed at me. His face, in the cone of my headlamp, was the careful blank face of a man who had decided, the way I had decided, that we were going to leave without making any sound that could be misunderstood. I gestured toward the entrance of the chamber. Garrett nodded. We walked out of the chamber. We walked at a steady, measured pace. We did not run. We did not whisper. We did not look back at the wall. We walked through the chamber, into the connecting passage, and back through the mile of horizontal cave that we had hiked in on. The walk-out took us about an hour. We did not speak the entire time. We came up out of the cave at about 11 in the morning. We hiked back to our cars at the parking pull-off. We sat in my car with the engine off and the windows down, and we did not speak for probably 15 minutes. Garrett finally said, "What was that?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "We are not putting that in the survey report." I said, "No, we are not." He said, "I am not coming back to this cave." I said, "I understand." We drove home. I wrote up a survey report over the following week that described the chamber as having a closed bedrock back wall with no continuation passage, and that recommended that the 1,992 future work item be marked as resolved on the basis that the documented opening was not present in the current cave geometry, likely as a result of an undocumented breakdown event in the intervening decades. The report did not mention the knocks. The map I submitted showed the chamber with a closed back wall and no continuation. The report was filed with our organization in August of 2022. In the 3 years since, Garrett has not returned to that cave. He has been clear with me, and with the organization's trip planners, that he is not available for any future trips into that system. He has not given a public reason. The organization has accepted his preference without question. I have returned twice. I have gone back twice in the 3 years since the original trip, both times alone, both times for follow-up survey work, that the organization had assigned to me, and that I had not felt I could refuse without raising questions. I went in February of 2023, and again in October of 2024. Both trips were short. Both times I went directly to the chamber with the back wall, completed the small survey work I had been assigned in the rest of the cave, and walked back out. Both times I stood in the chamber for a few minutes near the back wall. The wall has been silent on both of my return visits. I have not knocked the wall. I have not tested whether the entity behind the wall, whatever it is, would respond to a knock from my side. I have considered this many times. I have considered, in the slow, careful way that a structural engineer considers a closed system that he does not understand, whether knocking back would be a small kindness that might satisfy whatever has been knocking. I have considered, also, whether knocking back would be a confirmation that I am present and audible, and that something on the other side of the wall has been waiting for that confirmation, and that the response to the confirmation would not be something I would want to be present for. I have decided, both times I have stood in the chamber, that the question of which of those possibilities is correct is not a question I want to answer. I have looked, in the years since the original trip, at the small biographical records that our organization keeps on its older members. The 1,992 survey team was a team of 3. One of them, the team leader, passed in 2008 of natural causes at the age of 71. One of them moved to Florida in the late 1990s and is no longer in contact with our organization. The third has been, since the early 2000s, a quiet retired member who does not attend our gatherings and who lives somewhere in Middle Tennessee. I have considered, occasionally, contacting that third surveyor and asking him whether the 1,992 team had heard anything in the chamber when they had documented the continuation passage as a future work item. I have not done so. I have decided that the question would put a burden on him that he might not want to carry, and that if he had heard anything in 1992, he would not have wanted me to bring it up after 30 years of his having chosen not to discuss it. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that whatever has been knocking on the inside of that wall is doing so for reasons that are entirely its own, and that the knocks are not a request for help, and that the knocks are not the patient's signal of something that is waiting to be released. I have hoped that the wall, which has stood between the chamber and whatever lies behind it for the entire geological lifespan of the cave, is doing the work that walls do, which is to keep one side separate from the other side, and that the work is being done well, and that nobody on either side of the wall needs anybody else to do anything different. I have hoped, on the worst nights, that the knocks I heard in 2022 have not become more frequent in the years since. That whatever has been waiting behind the wall has decided, after my non-response and after the silence on my 2 return visits, that there is nobody on this side of the wall who is going to answer, and that it has settled back into whatever patient state it inhabited before our 2022 trip. I am 52 years old now, and I have continued to do survey work in other caves in our region, and I have come up out of every other cave I have surveyed in the 3 years since 2022 without having heard anything come back through any wall. I am grateful for that. I have a small framed photograph of the 1992 survey team on the wall of my home office, taken at the entrance to that cave 33 years ago. I do not look at the team leader's face when I pass the photograph. I do not know why. The wall in the cave has been silent on my last 2 visits. I hope it stays silent. I hope, if it ever knocks again, that the next caver who hears it has the sense, as I had, to not knock back. I had been a member of our caving organization for 38 years by the spring of 2023, having joined in 1985 when I was 25 years old and a young office worker in Roanoke, and I was 63 years old that April when I took on the job of digitizing the club's complete photo archive. I had served as the club secretary for the previous 12 years. The position was not a glamorous one. I handled the meeting minutes. I maintained the membership rolls. I corresponded with regional caving organizations on routine matters. I oversaw the small clubhouse we maintained in a converted basement space in a building owned by one of our older members. The clubhouse was where we kept our old records, our original survey reports, our photo albums, and the various small physical artifacts that an organization accumulates over the decades. The project I am writing about was a digital archive project that the club's executive committee had approved in the fall of 2022. The committee had decided, after some discussion, that we should scan and digitize the club's complete photo archive, which dated from the founding of our organization in 1962 through the present day, and make the digital archive available to members through a private cloud server. The motivation was practical. We had several thousand original photographs and prints in various states of preservation, some of them already showing the deterioration that decades of basement storage produces, and we wanted to preserve the historical record before any further damage occurred. The committee had asked me, as the secretary with the most institutional knowledge, to lead the scanning project, and I had agreed. I had set up a scanning station in the small back room of the clubhouse. I had bought a flatbed scanner of the kind that document archiving professionals use, with a high optical resolution and a flat color profile suitable for old photographic prints. I had purchased archival quality storage boxes for the originals after they were scanned. I had budgeted, with the executive committee's approval, for the time and the equipment, and I had committed to spending most of my Saturday mornings at the clubhouse, working through the archive in chronological order. I started with the earliest photographs in the archive, the small collection of black and white prints from the founding years of the club in the early 1960s. The work went well in the first few months. I scanned several hundred photographs from the 1960s and the 1970s, working slowly and carefully, cataloging each scan with the basic information about the trip, the cave, the date, and the team members where that information was available. The earlier photographs were mostly small group portraits at cave entrances, with the careful posed compositions that older cavers favored. Many of the team members in those photographs were people I had known personally over the years, many of them now deceased, and the work had a quiet, contemplative quality of revisiting the long history of an organization I had given 38 years of my life to. I would sit at the scanner on a Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee at my elbow and the basement quiet around me, and I would feel, as I worked through the boxes, the particular companionship that older photographs offer. The men and women in the prints were not strangers. I could put names to most of the faces. I could remember the trips, in many cases, even the trips I had not personally been on, because I had heard the stories told at gatherings over the decades. I reached the 1,987 photographs in the third week of April, 2023. The 1,987 photo collection was a substantial one because 1,987 had been a particularly active year for the club, with several major survey projects in Southern Virginia and Southern West Virginia that had each generated multiple group photographs. I worked through the 1,987 photographs over the course of about 10 days, scanning them one by one and writing out my catalog entries as I went. The first photograph in which I noticed the thin man was a group portrait taken at the entrance of a small cave in a rural county of Southern Virginia in October of 1987. The photograph was a posed shot of a survey team at the end of what had been a successful 3-day project to map a previously undocumented cave on a piece of private land. The team had assembled at the cave entrance for the standard group photo on the morning of their final day, with their gear stacked behind them and their helmets in their hands. The photographer, the team leader, had set up his camera on a tripod with the self-timer and had run back to join the group for the shot. I scanned the photograph at high resolution. I pulled up the scan on my laptop screen for cataloging. I started counting the team members. I counted 15 people in the photograph. The trip log that accompanied the photograph, which I had pulled from the 1,987 records, along with the print, listed 14 team members. I checked the log twice, 14 names, 14 signatures on the trip waiver, 14 entries in the daily attendance roster. I counted the people in the photograph again. 15. I want to describe what I saw. The team was arranged in 2 rows. The front row was kneeling on the ground in front of the cave entrance. 8 people, all of them in caving suits with their helmets in their laps. The back row was standing behind the front row. 6 people, all of them in caving suits with their helmets in their hands. That was 14. The 15th person was standing slightly behind the back row, partially obscured by the shoulder of one of the back row team members. He was a thin man, of indeterminate age in the photograph, but probably in his 50s or 60s, wearing what appeared to be old, plain work clothes rather than caving gear. A dark plaid flannel shirt, dark work pants. He had no helmet, he had no caving suit. He was not equipped for any kind of cave trip. He was simply standing there, behind the team, with his face mostly hidden by the back row caver's shoulder. The portion of his face that was visible in the photograph was the right side of his head, from the cheekbone up to the temple. The visible portion was clearly a human face, with the small specific details of skin texture and hair, and the edge of an eye. His hair was dark, possibly graying at the temple. His eye was open. He was looking, as far as I could tell from the partial view, directly at the camera. I sat at my laptop in the small back room of the clubhouse, and I looked at the photograph for probably 15 minutes. I tried to think. I considered, in the first several minutes, whether the 15th man might be a club member who had been on the trip but had not been listed on the trip log for some clerical reason. This was an unlikely explanation. The trip log had been filled out by the team leader, who had been a meticulous record keeper, and the team leader's daughter still attended our annual gatherings as an honorary member. I could verify the count with her if I needed to, but 14 was the documented number. 14 was the number that had been signed and witnessed. I considered whether the 15th man might have been a member of the landowner's family who had walked up to the cave entrance to watch the photograph being taken and had ended up in the shot accidentally. This was a more plausible explanation. Cavers were occasionally photographed alongside curious onlookers from rural landowning families. But the man in the photograph did not look like a curious onlooker. He was not standing at the periphery of the group looking in. He was standing within the group, behind the back row, in a position that the team itself would have noticed. There were 3 surviving members of the 1,987 team I had access to. The team leader's daughter, who had inherited her father's caving records. A retired man in his late 70s named Hollis, who lived in a small town in Southwest Virginia and who attended our quarterly meetings. And a woman named Estelle, who had been a young member of the team in 1987 and who was now in her early 60s and still active in the organization. I called the team leader's daughter that evening. She was a friendly, competent woman in her 50s named Denise, who had been very helpful with the archive project. I told her I was looking at the 1,987 cave entrance photograph and that I had a question about one of the people in the back of the group. I asked her if she had any information about a thin man in a flannel shirt who had been with the team. Denise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There were 14 people on that trip. Daddy was very particular about his trip logs. There was nobody else with the team." I asked her if anyone from the landowner's family might have come up to watch the photo being taken. She said the landowner had been an older bachelor who lived alone, who had come up to the cave once on the first day and then gone back down to his house, and who had not been there on the final day when the photograph was taken. She said she would ask Hollis. Denise called me back 2 days later. She had spoken with Hollis. Hollis had no recollection of any 15th person being with the team. He had no recollection of any landowner's family member being present for the photograph. He had been one of the back row standing cavers in the photo, and when she had described the position of the thin man behind him, he had been silent for a long time on the phone with her, and then had said, very quietly, that he did not remember anybody standing behind him during the photograph, and that nobody had been there as far as he knew. I called Estelle the next day. I asked her the same questions I had asked Denise. Estelle was quiet for a long time. She asked me to send her a high-resolution scan of the photograph. I did. She called me back about an hour later. She said, in a careful voice, that she had been one of the front-row kneeling cavers in the 1987 photograph, that she had been there when the photograph had been taken, that the team leader had set up the self-timer and had run back to join the group, that they had all held their pose for about 10 seconds while the timer counted down, and that there had been no 15th person. She remembered the moment clearly. She had been 26 years old at the time. The team had been a familiar group of people she had been working with all season. She would have noticed if a 15th person had been standing among them. There had not been one. I asked her, gently, whether she could think of any explanation for what was on the photograph. She said, "I cannot." I sat at the kitchen table in my house that evening with a printed copy of the photograph on the table in front of me. I looked at the thin man behind the back row. I looked at the partial view of his face. I tried to think about what I was looking at. I went back to the clubhouse the next Saturday. I pulled the rest of the 1,987 photographs from the archive. There were 10 or 11 group photographs from various trips that year. I scanned 5 of them at high resolution and pulled them up on my laptop. I checked each one carefully. In every one of the 5 photographs, the same thin man was visible in the background. He was always partially obscured. He was always behind the team. He was always wearing what appeared to be the same dark plaid flannel shirt and dark work pants, though the cropping of the photographs made it impossible to be entirely certain. He was always positioned in the back of the group, where he could be missed by a casual viewer, but could be identified by anyone who counted carefully or who looked specifically. In one of the photographs, taken at a cave entrance in southern West Virginia in March of 1987, his face was about a third visible. I could see, in this photograph, his eye and his cheekbone and a small portion of his mouth. His expression in this photograph was not quite the same as the partial expression in the October photograph. In the October photograph, the visible portion of his face had suggested a neutral expression. In the March photograph, the larger visible portion of his face suggested the trace of a small, careful smile, the kind of smile a person produces when they are aware of being photographed and are quietly pleased about it. I scanned no further. I removed the 5 photographs from my scanning station. I packed them into a small folder I had brought with me. I left the rest of the 1,987 photographs in their original storage box. I went home that afternoon. I did not go back to the clubhouse the following Saturday. I did not work on the archive project for the next 2 months. I have a small folder on a shelf in my home office, in a drawer that I keep locked. The folder contains the 6 photographs in which I have personally identified the thin man. 6 photographs. I stopped counting after I found the 5th one. I closed the box. I came home. I have not opened it in 2 years. I have, since 2023, spent occasional evenings looking at the 6 photographs I do have on the kitchen table after my husband has gone to bed, with a magnifying glass and a careful patience. I have studied the man's partial appearances in each photograph. I have noted the consistency of his clothing across the 6 images. I have observed that the visible portions of his face suggest a man of about 60 in 1987, lean, with dark hair going gray at the temples, with a face that has the deep, weathered lines of an older man who has spent his life outdoors. I have not shown the photographs to any current club members. I have not scanned them into the digital archive. I removed them from the archive project entirely, replacing them in the original storage box at the clubhouse, with notes indicating that the originals had been damaged during scanning and would not be available for the digital archive. The executive committee accepted this without question. They trust me. I have given them no reason to doubt me. I have continued to serve as club secretary for the 2 years since. I have continued the digital archive project at a slower pace, working through the photographs from years other than 1987. I have not pulled any other group photographs from any other year for examination. I have not gone looking for the thin man in any photograph from any other decade. I have stopped counting how many photographs in the club's archive he might be in. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the thin man is something contained to the year 1987, that he was, for whatever reason, present at the cave entrances of the survey teams during that one particular year, and that he has not been present in the years before or in the years after, and that the digital archive of our other decades is safe to assemble. I have hoped that the partial nature of his appearance in the photographs, the way his face is always mostly hidden behind a shoulder, is a measure of his shyness, and that he was not the kind of presence that wanted to be fully seen, and that his presence in the back of those 6 teams was a small, quiet thing he was doing for reasons that are entirely his own. I have hoped, on the worst nights, that he is not waiting for a photographer to find him, that he is not in the photograph because he wants the photograph to be examined, that my noticing him in 2023 was not the moment he had been waiting 36 years for somebody to notice him. The thin man does not appear in any photograph in our archive that predates 1987. I have checked. I went back through the photographs from the 1970s, the 1980s up through 1986. He is not in any of them. The earliest appearance of him is the March 1987 photograph at the cave entrance in southern West Virginia. I do not know what changed about our organization in early 1987 that would have caused him to begin appearing in our photographs. I do not know what changed about us. I do not know whether anything about us changed at all. I have not gone back to the clubhouse to check the photographs from years after 1987. I have decided, the way certain things get decided in a club secretary's life, that the question of how many other photographs the thin man is in is not a question I want to answer. I have stopped counting. I have committed to stopping counting. The folder in my locked drawer at home contains 6 photographs. 6 is the number I am willing to know about. I will not open the folder. I will not go looking for him in other years. I have a granddaughter who is 6 years old, and when she comes to stay with me on weekends, she sometimes asks me about the photographs on the wall of my office. I tell her about the cavers I have known. I tell her about the caves they have worked. I do not tell her about the thin man. She is 6. The number matches. I find the number reassuring. I do not know why. I have decided not to think about it. I keep the folder locked. I will not open it again. I hope nobody opens it after I am gone. He is in 6 photographs. He may be in 600. I have stopped counting.